On the morning of August 1st, 2024, a woman in a white trouser suit and emerald earrings stood at the front of a church in Athens and buried the man she had been married to for 59 years. The church was full. The Greek royal family had come from across Europe. The wreaths arrived from Monaco, from the Netherlands, from Spain. Her daughters stood beside her, each of them bearing the title that she had never been permitted to carry. Her daughters were princesses. She was Marina Karella, just Marina Karella, the same name she had walked in with on the 7th of February 1965, when the newspapers had covered the wedding at the royal palace in Athens, and the Times had noted, in the same paragraph that announced the marriage, that his wife will not have a royal title, not a warning, not a debate. A settled fact, delivered in a single subordinate clause, the way institutions announce what they have decided about a person before the person has had time to object. She had been one of the most serious young artists in Greece when she met him. Not a society beauty dabbling in watercolors. A genuine fine artist, trained at the Athens School of Fine Arts under Yannis Tsarouchis, then at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, then at the Kokoschka Summer Academy in Salzburg, under Oskar Kokoschka himself, one of the giants of 20th century European painting. She had a trajectory, she had a voice, she had the specific quality of an artist who has been formed by the right teachers at the right time, and who is about to discover what the formation was for. Then she married the prince. Then the Greek military junta seized power, and the royal family fled into exile, and they stayed, the only members of the Greek royal family permitted to remain in their own country, until the staying became impossible, and they left for Paris in 1972, with their two small daughters, and the specific condition of the royal exile, which is the condition of people who belong to an institution that no longer has a country, and who are managing their lives in the space between what they were and what they are now. The daughters went to school in Paris. They were princesses. Their mother was Marina Karella. She went to her studio and painted. She painted for 60 years. Her work ended up in the Pompidou Center and the Menil collection and the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection and in the Benaki Museum retrospective of 2005, which is the recognition that serious institutions extend to artists whose work the serious institutions have concluded deserves to be there. Robert Mapplethorpe photographed her. The portrait is the frontispiece of her monograph, and people who have seen it describe the specific quality of the image, which is the quality of someone who has been photographed by the greatest portrait photographer of the 20th century, and who looks, in the photograph, exactly like the person the photograph was made of, rather than the person the occasion required her to be. The occasion always required her to be someone else, the wife of the prince, the mother of the princesses, the consort, the commoner who had married into the royal family, and who remained, in the official record of the Greek dynasty, for the 59 years of her marriage, Marina Karella. Not Princess Marina, not Her Royal Highness, not anything that the institution was prepared to extend to the woman whose husband had given up his throne rights to marry her. He gave them up. She was still not enough. Here is what this account examines. Not the love story, although it was apparently a genuine one, and it lasted 59 years, and it ended in a church in Athens, with emerald earrings, and daughters who were princesses, and a woman who was still just her own name. Not the art, although the art is the part of the story that the royal coverage has most consistently treated as the supporting material for the main narrative, rather than as the main narrative itself. What this account examines is the space between those two things, the space in which a woman of serious artistic formation entered a royal family that refused to name her, survived a military coup, raised two princesses in Paris exile, made the work that ended up in the Pompidou Center, and stood in a white trouser suit in August 2024 at the front of a church full of people whose institutions had decided, 59 years earlier, that she was not one of them. She outlasted all of them. The junta is gone. The Greek monarchy is gone. The king who refused to give her a title died in January 2023. Her daughters married into other dynasties and became a duchess and the wife of a businessman and moved on. The prince is buried at Thyssen beside his parents. And Marina Karella, who was never given the name they owed her, is still making work. This account is about what it cost to be that specific woman in that specific situation for that specific amount of time, and about what the institutions that organized the situation thought they were doing, and about what they actually did, and about the distance between the two. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Theodoros Karellas built his textile fortune in Athens, in the decades after the Second World War, with the specific discipline of the Greek industrialist, who had survived occupation and civil war, and who understood, from the surviving, that the fortune required the attention of someone who treated its construction as the primary obligation of their working life. The fortune was real, and the attention was real, and the household it produced was the household of a family that had arrived at a specific position in Athenian society, not the position of the old aristocracy, not the position of the political class, but the position of the serious commercial family whose money was recent enough to still carry the texture of its own making, and whose culture was the culture of people who had decided that the making of the fortune did not preclude the making of something else alongside it. The something else, in the Karellas household, was art. Marina, born on the 17th of July 1940, as the occupation was ending and the civil war that would follow it was beginning its preparation, grew up in the specific environment of a family that took aesthetic seriousness as the natural companion of commercial seriousness rather than its opposite, and the growing up produced in her the quality that every account of her formation identifies as its earliest legible feature, which was the quality of someone who had been drawing since before she could explain why, and who had organized her relationship to the visual world around her, with the concentration of someone for whom the visual world was not the background of experience, but its primary content. She drew on the walls of the Karellas house. This detail has appeared in several of the interviews she has given across the decades, always in the specific register of the illustrative anecdote that artists reach for when they are trying to explain to an interviewer who was not there what the beginning felt like, and in Marina's, telling the walls were not the surface of childhood mischief, but the first available studio, the place where the hand could do what the hand was already organizing itself to do. The hand had been organizing itself for as long as she could account for it, and the accounting was the accounting of someone whose formation was already in progress before the institutions that would formalize it had entered her life. The Athens School of Fine Arts entered her life in 1960, when she was 20 years old, and the entering was the entering of an institution into a person, rather than the other way around, which is the specific quality of the student who arrives at the school already knowing what they are there for, and who is capable of using the institution's resources in the direction of the formation that is already underway, rather than waiting for the institution to supply the formation from scratch. The Athens School was not the institution that would have supplied it from scratch in any case, because the Athens School in 1960 was not an institution in which the formation was supplied from scratch. It was an institution that assumed the seriousness of the students it admitted and that provided, alongside that assumption, the teachers whose own seriousness justified the assumption. Yannis Tsarouchis was the first of those teachers. He was one of the major figures of 20th century Greek painting, a man whose own formation had taken him from Athens to Paris and back, and who had spent the preceding decades producing a body of work that the Greek and international art worlds had recognized as the work of someone who had found the specific way of looking that was his own, and whose students received, from proximity to that specific way of looking, the specific education that proximity to a genuine artistic sensibility provides. Tsarouchis taught Marina Karella to look at form, at light, at the relationship between the two that makes a picture hold or fail to hold. He taught her these things not in the form of instruction that can be written down and reproduced, but in the form of demonstration and correction, and the specific quality of attention that a teacher pays to a student's work when the teacher has concluded that the work is worth the attention. He paid Marina's work that attention. The paying was itself the teaching, because what the attention communicated was the assessment that what she was making something real, rather than something approximate. Oskar Kokoschka arrived in her formation through the International Summer Academy in Salzburg, where she studied in the early 1960s. Kokoschka was 80 years old when Marina encountered him, one of the last surviving figures of the expressionist movement that had organized European painting's response to the early 20th century's specific quality of psychological crisis, and his age had produced in him not the mellowing that age sometimes produces in people whose temperament has organized itself around the expression of intense feeling, but the specific authority of someone who had been expressing intense feeling through paint for 60 years, and who had reached the point at which the expression was as natural as breathing and as unconsidered, and therefore as honest. He told his students that the act of drawing was the act of seeing made visible, that the hand that drew what it saw was the hand that proved the seeing had occurred, and that the artist who could not draw from life could not draw at all, because the life was the source, and everything else was the reproduction of a reproduction. Marina drew from life. The training at Athens and at Salzburg and at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where she studied from 1963 to 1965, produced in her the specific technical formation that the European fine arts tradition provides, when it is applied with seriousness to a student who is capable of receiving it, which is the formation of someone who has learned to make what she sees, and who has learned, from the learning, that what she sees is not what everyone sees, but the specific product of a specific sensibility encountering the world, and that the specificity is the art rather than the obstacle to it. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the early 1960s was an institution at the intersection of two moments in the history of European painting: the moment of the tradition, whose methods the school had been transmitting since its founding, and the moment of the challenges to that tradition that the preceding decades of modernism had accumulated. And the intersection was the environment that produced, in the students who were capable of inhabiting it, rather than merely passing through it, the specific education of someone who had learned the tradition thoroughly enough to understand what the challenges to it were actually challenging, which is the only adequate foundation for the making of the challenges oneself. Marina inhabited it rather than passing through it. She was 25 years old when she finished the Paris formation and returned to Athens, and what she brought back to Athens was the formation in its completed form, the technical equipment and the artistic intelligence and the specific vision that 3 years in the most concentrated artistic environment in the world had produced in someone who had been ready for that environment since she had started drawing on the walls of the Karella's house. She had a trajectory. She had the specific momentum of someone who has been moving in a direction for 25 years and who has reached the point at which the direction is clear and the momentum is self-sustaining. Then Prince Michael of Greece and Denmark walked into her life. He was 26 years old, the son of the late Prince Christopher of Greece and the late Princess Françoise d'Orléans, a man whose father had died when he was 1 year old and who had been raised substantially by his mother's family, the Orléans, the former French royal family, who had been managing their own specific variety of dynastic displacement since 1848. He had studied at the Athens Conservatory and then at the École d'Interprétation at the Sorbonne, and he was embarked on a doctoral program in political science while serving as an officer in the Greek army. He was intelligent, widely read, genuinely curious about the world in the way that people whose formation has exposed them to multiple cultures and multiple languages and multiple ways of organizing the relationship between the past and the present are curious, and he was deeply interested in the relationship between power and the people who hold it, and the ways that the holding changes both, which would eventually produce the 30 books he would write across the following 6 decades on the subject of dynasties and the people who had lived inside them. He had also, before he met Marina, identified the specific quality of his situation in the Greek royal family, which was the quality of someone who was a member of the institution without being at its center, a prince of Greece and Denmark without the kind of proximity to the throne's operational reality that proximity to the succession would have produced. He was third in line at the time of the marriage's negotiation, but the third place was the third place of an institution whose relationship to the country it nominally still ruled was already the relationship of the decorative rather than the operational, and the decorative relationship had produced in him the specific freedom of someone who could observe the institution from inside it without being fully consumed by the obligation to maintain it. The meeting was the meeting that the available accounts of the couple describe in the terms that such meetings are usually described in the available accounts, which are the terms of the social world rather than the terms of the internal experience. and the social world of Athens in the early 1960s was the social world in which a painter who had just returned from the École des Beaux-Arts and a prince who was studying political science at the Sorbonne occupied enough of the same geography to encounter each other. They encountered each other. The encounter produced the attachment that required 2 years of negotiation with the Greek royal family before it could produce a marriage, and the negotiation was the negotiation that morganatic marriages of the period required. The negotiation's terms were the terms that King Constantine II eventually agreed to in October 1964, and the terms were the terms that the institution's management of the situation had produced, which were the terms of the managed permission. Michael could marry Marina, but Michael would be required to renounce his rights of succession and his descendants' rights of succession before the king would issue the legally required authorization, and Marina would not receive the title of Princess of Greece and Denmark and would not receive the style of Her Royal Highness, because the institution's understanding of what she was and what the marriage's terms required her to remain was the understanding that had organized the managed permission's conditions. She knew the conditions before the wedding. The Times had made them public on the morning of the 8th of February 1965, in the coverage of the wedding that had taken place the previous day at the Royal Palace in Athens, and the coverage had contained the sentence that this account established in its opening pages: "His wife will not have a royal title." She had read the papers. She had married him anyway, in the ballroom of the Royal Palace, in a Greek Orthodox ceremony, attended by King Constantine as best man, wearing a white gown and a diamond tiara and a 30-foot veil, with approximately 25 guests in the room, because the marriage was the marriage of people who had negotiated for 2 years for permission to make it, and who had arrived at the ceremony with the specific quality of relief that the arrival of the thing one has been fighting for produces. What she did not know, on the morning of the 7th of February 1965, was what the managed permission's conditions were going to mean across the 59 years that followed. She knew the title would not come. She did not know what the not coming of the title would feel like inside the institution that had refused it, inside the exile that the junta would impose, inside the Paris years and the Patmos house and the studio with the burgundy floor and the 2 daughters who were princesses while their mother was still Marina Karella. The knowing of those things required the living of them, and the living of them had not yet begun. It began the following year, in 1966, when she presented her first exhibition at the Festival of Two Worlds in Spoleto, Italy, and the exhibition was the first public statement of the formation's product, the work that the Athens and Paris and Salzburg years had produced, and that was now being offered to the public that art exhibitions are offered to. The exhibition was received as the work of a serious artist, and the receiving was the receiving that the work warranted, and the warranting was the evidence that the formation had done what it was supposed to do. The evidence existed. The institution had already decided what it was going to do with it. And what it was going to do with it was what institutions always do with the evidence of the person they have decided is not going to be one of them, which is to manage it into the background of the story they are telling about someone else. The managing began immediately and lasted 59 years, and what it produced is the subject that the remaining parts of this account examine. On the 21st of April 1967, at approximately 2 in the morning, tanks moved through the streets of Athens, and a group of colonels seized control of the Greek government in the specific manner that military coups in the 20th century produced their results when they were well organized, which was quickly and before the people whose displacement they required had the opportunity to organize a response. The coup was led by Georgios Papadopoulos, a colonel in the Greek army, in which Prince Michael was also serving as an officer, and it displaced the existing government and suspended the constitution and imposed the military administration that would govern Greece for the following 7 years, and it produced, in the immediate days following its installation, the specific requirement of decision that every member of the Greek royal family had to make, which was the decision of what to do now. What the royal family did, in the main, was leave. King Constantine II, who was 26 years old when the coup occurred, and who had been on the throne for 3 years following the death of his father Paul I in 1964, attempted a counter-coup in December 1967, flew north to rally the army, failed to rally the army, and flew his family to Rome, and then to London, and into the specific condition of the royal exile that the Greek royal family had been practicing since at least 1917, when Marina Karella's future mother-in-law's generation had first experienced it. The court that had existed in Athens and at Tatoi and at the summer palaces dispersed to the European capitals where the relatives were available to receive it, and the Greek royal family became, for the second time in the century and the third time in its history, a family without a throne and with the specific variety of prominence that the throneless dynasty carries, which is the prominence of the significant without the authority of the operational. Michael and Marina did not leave with the others. They were, by the documentation of the period and by Marina's own subsequent accounts of those years, the only members of the Greek royal family who had been granted permission by the junta to remain in Greece, and the granting of the permission was the specific act of a military government managing the symbolic dimension of its relationship to the displaced dynasty in the direction of the appearance of normalcy, which was the appearance that the presence of at least some members of the royal family in the country could provide. The junta did not want the entire royal family on Greek soil, because the entire royal family on Greek soil was the entire royal family as a potential rallying point for the opposition, and the opposition was the thing the junta had organized itself to prevent from organizing. But the entire royal family abroad was the entire royal family as a propaganda problem, the suggestion that the regime was so hostile to its own history that it had expelled every member of the institution that had organized that history. Michael and Marina occupied the specific middle position that the junta's calculation required, the members who were sufficiently marginal to the succession's operational reality to be manageable and sufficiently present to serve the normalcy appearance. They remained. The remaining was the remaining of two people who had their own reasons for remaining beyond the junta's institutional calculation, because Marina's family was in Athens, and Michael's connection to Greece was the connection of someone whose formation had been organized around the Greek identity that the Orléans family had raised him in without fully replacing, and the connection required the presence rather than the exile for its maintenance. What the remaining actually meant, in the practical terms of daily life in Athens under the junta, was the life of people who were navigating the specific social geography of a city under military rule in the specific position of people who were adjacent to the displaced dynasty without being the displaced dynasty's operational center. The social geography of Athens under the colonels was the geography of a city that had been reorganized around the authority of people who were not the people who had previously organized it, and the reorganization produced the specific social atmosphere of a military dictatorship in its early years, which was the atmosphere of people who were present and performing the normalcy that the regime required, while processing privately the specific combination of fear and anger and adaptation that the presence and the performance required them to manage simultaneously. Marina went to her studio. The studio was where the junta did not reach, not because the junta was incapable of reaching it, but because a painter's studio in Athens in 1967 was not the kind of space that a military government organized its attention around controlling, unless the painting being produced was painting that the government had identified as politically threatening, and Marina's painting was not painting that the government had identified as politically threatening. It was painting that the person producing it found necessary in the way that artists find the studio necessary, which is the way of someone for whom the making of the work is the activity that organizes the experience of existing, rather than a supplementary activity added to an existence organized around something else. The two daughters arrived during the junta years. Alexandra was born on the 15th of October 1968, 18 months after the coup, in Athens, and Olga was born on the 17th of November 1971, also in Athens, and their births placed Marina in the specific position of someone who was raising children in a country under military rule, while managing the artistic practice that the births had not suspended, and the marriage's social world, and the specific institutional situation of being the wife of a prince who was the only member of his dynasty. The position had multiple simultaneous requirements, and the managing of the requirements was the managing of someone who had been practicing the management of multiple simultaneous requirements since the wedding had placed her inside the institution that had refused to name her and inside the social world that the institution generated. The daughters were born princesses. This is the piece of the junta years that the institutional record treats as unremarkable, because the daughters' status as princesses was the automatic consequence of their father's position and required no specific institutional decision to produce. Marina's non-status as non-princess was equally automatic, equally the consequence of the institution's decision, and the two automaticities coexisted inside the same household in the specific way that institutional decisions coexist with the human beings they are applied to, which is by producing an environment in which the decision's consequences are present every day in the texture of the daily life, without requiring the decision to be acknowledged or examined or justified by the people producing the texture. The texture, in the Athens house where the family lived during the junta years, was the texture that Marina has described across decades of interviews, in the specific register of someone who has processed the experience thoroughly enough to describe it without performing either the grievance or the acceptance that the description might seem to require. She described the household as a household. She described the marriage as a marriage. She described the painting as what she did and as the thing that organized the rest, in the sense that the rest was manageable because the painting was happening, and the painting was happening because the rest was being managed. And the circularity was the circularity that a genuine artistic practice produces in the life of someone whose artistic practice is genuine, which is the circularity of the thing that sustains the person and the person who sustains the thing. She was working in the direction of what would become, in the 1970s, her white paintings, the series that the gallery world would receive as the most significant work of her early career, and that the critics who examined them identified as the work of someone who had found the specific relationship to the blank surface that painting's history had always organized itself around negotiating, which was the relationship of someone who understood the white, not as the absence of the painting, but as the painting's primary material. The surface, whose specific quality of light the marks were in conversation with, rather than covering. The white paintings were the product of years of preparation, and the preparation was happening in Athens during the junta, in the studio that the junta had not organized its attention around controlling. The preparation ended in 1972, when the decision to leave was made. The available accounts of the decision describe it as a decision that Michael and Marina reached together, for the combination of practical and personal reasons that decisions to leave places one has been living in are reached, which were the reasons of the daughter's education and the specific quality of life that the junta's continued governance of Greece was producing, and the specific exhaustion of being the people who had remained when everyone else had left, and who were no longer finding the remaining's justifications adequate to its costs. They had been the only members of the royal family in Greece for 5 years. The 5 years had produced the daughters and the studio work and the specific experience of living inside a military dictatorship in the position of the princess who was not a princess, and the experience had produced the decision. Paris received them in 1972, with the specific quality of Paris receiving exiled royalty, which it had been doing since at least 1830, and which it had developed across the subsequent century and a half into something approaching a civic specialty. The city's relationship to the displaced dynasties of Europe was the relationship of the city that had organized itself as the European capital of culture and that had discovered, across the decades of receiving the people whom the political reorganization of Europe had produced as its displaced, that the displaced were frequently the interesting and that the interesting were good for the city in ways that the displaced themselves were good for each other. The Greek royal family had been in Paris before, in the exile years of the 1920s, and the memory of that exile was part of the family's institutional memory that the current exile was activating. Marina was 32 years old when they arrived in Paris. She had 2 daughters under 5, a husband who was beginning the writing career that would eventually produce 30 books, a household to establish in a city where she had studied a decade earlier and where the art world she had been trained in was still operating, and the specific combination of freedom and displacement that the exile produced in someone who was arriving in the city she had studied in, now as the wife of a prince, rather than as the student who had come to learn. The Gallery Iolas was the specific gallery that received her work in Paris in the years following the arrival, and the receiving was the receiving that changed the terms of what Marina Karella's artistic career was going to mean in the international art world. Alexander Iolas was the most significant dealer of his generation in the relationship between the New York and European art worlds, a man who had represented Max Ernst and René Magritte and Andy Warhol, and who had developed across his decades of dealing the specific eye for the work that the art world had not yet organized its attention around, but that the attention, once organized, would find necessary. He took Marina's work on. She described the taking on, in the interview that the Artflyer publication preserved, in the specific terms of someone describing a professional validation whose significance she had understood at the moment of its occurrence. "When Iolas took me on," she said, "it was a celebration day. He would electrify everything." The white paintings were shown at the Gallery Iolas in Paris in 1975. They were shown to an art world that had been processing, across the preceding decade, the specific question of what painting was for in the aftermath of the challenges to painting that the 1960s had generated, and the question was being processed in the specific way that the art world processes questions about what things are for, which is by looking at what the best practitioners of the thing are making and deciding whether the making answers the question or redirects it. The white paintings redirected it. The critics who wrote about them described the specific quality of the work in terms that the terminology of abstraction provides, and that translated, in the terms that are available to someone who has not seen the paintings, as the description of work that was doing something with the relationship between presence and absence that the painting tradition's engagement with the white surface had been preparing for, and that Marina's specific vision had found a way to produce. The production was happening in the specific context of the exile, of the apartment in Paris where the daughters were growing up as princesses of a country that no longer had a monarchy, of the marriage to the man who had given up his throne rights to make it, and whose giving up had produced not the recognition that the sacrifice might have been expected to generate, but the managed permission of an institution that had concluded the sacrifice was sufficient to authorize the marriage, without being sufficient to authorize the naming of the person the marriage had admitted. Marina was making the white paintings in this context, and the context was not the context that appears in the critical literature about the white paintings, because the critical literature is the literature of the art world rather than the literature of the woman, and the art world and the woman are not always the same story. The story they are not always is the story this account is telling, and it requires both of them to be present simultaneously rather than sequentially, which is the requirement that the institution's management of Marina Karella had always refused to meet, by insisting that the story it was willing to tell was the story of one of them, and that the other one could organize itself around the edges of that story as background. The background is where this account declines to leave her. The apartment that Michael and Marina established in Paris in the early 1970s was in the 16th arrondissement, which is the address that tells you something before you have been inside it, because the 16th arrondissement is the address of the specific variety of Parisian life that the European displaced aristocracy has organized itself around across the decades of its displacement. The address of the wide streets and the formal buildings and the proximity to the Bois de Boulogne that the people who had come from elsewhere and who needed Paris to be organized around the quality of life they associated with the elsewhere they had left, found most available in the French capital's specific geography. The Greek royal family in Paris was part of a larger community of the displaced that the 16th social world contained, and the containing produced the specific social environment of people who shared the institutional memory of thrones and palaces and the formal occasions that thrones and palaces require, and who were now managing that memory in the apartments of a city that was not the country any of them had come from. Michael began writing in these years. The writing was the writing that his formation had been preparing for longer than either of them had understood during the years of the military service and the political science doctorate, and the preparation had included not only the reading and the thinking, but the specific access to the insider knowledge of the European dynasties that his position at the intersection of several of them provided. He knew, from the inside, the stories of the families that the history books approached from the outside, and the knowing from the inside was the specific credential that his books would carry, and that the readers of royal biography found most valuable, which was the credential of the person who had sat at the tables where the people being written about had sat, and who had heard the anecdotes that the official record did not contain, and who was now organizing those anecdotes into the narrative that the official record required someone from the inside to provide. The first books appeared in the 1970s, and the books continued across the following decades, 30 of them in total, published in French and translated into the languages that the international market for royal biography commanded. The books were well received. They were received in the specific register that books about dynasties by members of dynasties are received, which was the register of the insider account that the outside reader could not produce for themselves, and that the inside account made available in the form of the book. And the register was the register that sold and that produced the specific variety of cultural prominence that the well-received book about a subject the reading public found interesting always produces. Michael of Greece became, across the decades of the writing, a recognizable figure in the specific world of the royal biographer, a man whose name on the cover of a book about a European dynasty communicated to the reader that the book was written by someone who had been in the rooms where the dynasty's private life had been conducted. Marina was in her studio. The studio was the counterpart to the writing study, the room in which the other career of the household was being conducted, and the two rooms were in the same apartment producing the two products that the household contained, and the household's coverage in the social and royal press of the period organized itself around one of the products and mentioned the other. The one it organized itself around was Michael's. The one it mentioned was Marina's. The mentioning was the specific form of the acknowledgement that the management of the not-quite member produces in the coverage of the institution, which was the mention that established the presence, without examining the content, the clause in the profile of the prince that noted his wife was an artist, without engaging with the art as the subject rather than the biography. She was making the work that would end up in the Pompidou Center. The Pompidou Center had opened in Paris in January 1977, the building that Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers had designed for the Plateau Beaubourg, and its opening had reorganized the geography of contemporary art in Paris in the way that new major institutions reorganize the geography of the fields they enter, by providing a specific gravity around which the field's activity arranged itself. The Pompidou's collection of modern and contemporary art was being assembled in the years of its early operation with the specific ambition of the institution that understands itself as the definitive museum of its field, and that is therefore acquiring the work that it has determined the definitive museum of its field is required to have. The acquisition of Marina Karella's work by the Pompidou was the acquisition of an institution that had assessed the work on the terms that institutions of that seriousness apply to their acquisitions, which were the terms of the work's quality and its contribution to the field, rather than the terms of the artist's social position. The social position was the position that the Greek royal family's press coverage organized itself around, and the press coverage's organization around the social position was the organization that produced, in the management of the period's coverage of Michael and Marina, the specific asymmetry that this account is examining. The Pompidou had acquired Marina Karella's work because the Pompidou's curators had concluded it was the work that the Pompidou's collection required. The royal press covered Marina Karella as the wife of Prince Michael of Greece and Denmark because the royal press's understanding of what the story was organized itself around the prince rather than around the person the prince had married, and the person the prince had married was therefore the person whose work was in the Pompidou, but whose coverage was organized around her relationship to the person who was not. Robert Mapplethorpe was in Paris in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with the specific frequency of the American photographer who had identified the European art world's social network as the network in which his own work and reputation were best served by the sustained presence that the visiting rather than the residency permitted, and the identification had been correct in the way that Mapplethorpe's identifications tended to be correct, which was the way of someone who read the social world he was operating in with the precision of a photographer reading the light of the room he was photographing. He encountered Marina in this social world, and the encounter produced the friendship that their subsequent accounts of each other have described, in the terms of two people who recognize something in each other that the social world around them did not always recognize in either of them individually, which was the seriousness of the artistic commitment that the social world's tendency to organize itself around the social position, rather than the artistic production, consistently undervalued. Mapplethorpe photographed her. The portrait is the image that exists at the front of her monograph, the frontispiece that the publisher chose because it was the image that said the most about who the subject of the monograph was, and what it says, in the specific language of a Mapplethorpe portrait, is the language of the person photographed exactly as they are. Mapplethorpe's portraits are not the portraits of social performance. They are the portraits of the person who exists underneath the social performance, the person whose specific quality of being reveals itself to the camera when the camera is in the hands of someone who has decided to find it. The portrait found Marina rather than the consort, the artist rather than the princess who was not a princess, the woman whose specific quality of self-possession had been developed through 30 years of making work in environments that were not organized around the making of the work. The Earl McGrath Gallery in New York was where Marina's work reached the American art world in the form of the exhibitions she mounted there across the 1980s, and the reaching was the reaching of an artist whose European reputation, built through the Iolas shows and the institutional acquisitions, was being extended into the American market that the 1980s New York art world represented. Earl McGrath was a figure in the overlap between the art world and the social world that New York in the 1980s produced in specific concentrations, a man whose gallery represented serious work and whose social life represented the specific variety of the seriously social that the decade and the city generated, and the gallery's representation of Marina's work placed it in the context of both dimensions of McGrath's operation. Jack Pearson was among the people Marina encountered in the New York gallery world of the 1980s, a photographer and artist whose work was organized around the specific relationship between the glamorous and the melancholic that the decade's specific quality of surface and depth produced in the artists who were paying attention to the relationship rather than to one dimension of it at the expense of the other. Pearson photographed Marina for the fashion magazine Issue, which was the fashion magazine that was attempting, in the period of its publication, to produce the version of fashion coverage that was organized around the aesthetic rather than the commercial, and that was doing so by publishing photographs that the commercial publications would not have recognized as fashion photography, and that the art publications would have recognized as the work of artists who had decided to make their images in the context of fashion. The photographs of Marina that Pearson made for Issue were the photographs that the magazine's editor placed alongside the fashion coverage, because the photographs said something about the relationship between beauty and the artistic seriousness that had produced the beauty that the magazine was trying to say. What the photographs said was what the Mapplethorpe portrait had said from the different angle of a different photographer's eye, which was that the person in front of the camera was someone whose presence had a quality that the camera could register if the camera was operated by someone capable of registering it. And the quality was the quality of someone who had spent decades making work in the specific conditions of being the person the institution had refused to name, while making work that the institutions of the art world had concluded was required. The two things had coexisted in the same person across the same decades, and the coexistence had produced the specific quality that the photographers were registering, which was the quality of a person who had been formed under pressure and who wore the formation the way that people who have been formed under pressure wear it, which is without the performance of the formation, because the performance is unnecessary when the formation is real. The Menil collection in Houston acquired her work. The Menil collection is the collection that Dominique de Menil assembled across the decades of her curatorial life in Houston, and the assembling was the assembling of one of the most serious private collections of modern and contemporary art in the United States, a collection whose quality the Menil Foundation has maintained since Dominique de Menil's death in 1997, in the form of the museum that the collection became. The Thyssen-Bornemisza collection in Madrid acquired her work. The Thyssen-Bornemisza is the collection that Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza built across the post-war decades, and that became, in 1992, the Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, one of the three major art museums in a city that takes the three major art museums as seriously as any city in the world takes the institutions it has decided are the expression of its cultural seriousness. The Benaki Museum in Athens organized a retrospective of her work in 2005. The acknowledgement that a city makes of an artist when the city has concluded that the artist's contribution to the field has been sufficient to warrant the retrospective's specific form of institutional recognition. The institutional recognition was real, and it was serious, and it was organized entirely around the work rather than around the person who made the work's relationship to the Greek royal family, which was the specific quality of the art world's assessment of Marina Karella that distinguished it from every other institutional assessment of her that the preceding 4 decades had produced. The Greek royal family's institutional assessment was organized around the relationship. The Pompidous was not. The Menils was not. The Thyssens was not. The Benakis was not. The art world's institutions had decided, on the basis of the work, that the work was the subject rather than the biography, and the deciding was the deciding that the institution that had refused to name her had never been willing to make, and the not willing was the not willing that had organized everything else. Michael's books were selling. His Paris publisher was producing them at the rate that a writer produces books when the writing has become the primary occupation, and the primary occupation is organized around the subject that the writer has identified as the subject for which his specific position provides the specific advantage, which was the royal biography that the inside position made available. The books were appearing under the name Prince Michael of Greece, which was the name that his position in the dynasty provided, and that the publisher used because the publisher understood that the name communicated the credential to the reader in the specific way that credentials communicate themselves in the royal biography market. Marina's work was appearing in institutions under the name Marina Karella, the same name she had arrived with, the same name the Times had placed in the subordinate clause, the same name that meant that when the work was in the Pompidou Center in Paris and the prince's book was in the bookshop across the street from the Pompidou, the two products of the same household appeared to the world in the specifically different relationship to the institution that had produced one of them and refused to produce the other, and the refusal was visible in the name that the institution had decided she would keep, which was the name of the person who was not one of them. The island helped. Patmos is a small island in the Dodecanese, in the eastern Aegean, built around the monastery of St. John the Theologian, that sits on the hill above the village of Cora, with the specific authority of an institution that has been organizing the island's character since 1088. The couple had been invited to the island by a friend one year, and had understood immediately that it was the place that the Paris years had been making necessary, and they had bought and rebuilt a house on the island 30 years before the 2024 interview, in which Marina described sitting in the courtyard above the whitewashed rooftops and the nautical blue of the Aegean, while Michael read in his office behind her. The studio at Patmos was the studio that the Art Flyer interview described in the terms that the interviewer had found on arrival, which were the terms of the room whose floor was splashed with paint in the pattern that 30 years of making work in the room had produced, which looked from above, the interviewer noted, like an abstract expressionist painting. On the desk were the watercolor strokes and the penciled notes. On the wall was a photograph. The photograph was the Mapplethorpe portrait, the frontispiece of the monograph, the image of the person who existed underneath the social performance, looking at the camera with the specific quality of the person who has spent decades in the making of work, in conditions that were not organized around the making of the work, and who has arrived, through the making, at the position of someone for whom the conditions are no longer the primary thing. The primary thing was the work. It had always been the primary thing. The institution had decided it was not the primary thing, and the deciding had organized everything else. In the formal occasions of the Greek royal family's social calendar, which continued to exist as a social calendar after the calendar's institutional basis had been removed by the referendum of December 1974 that abolished the monarchy, Marina occupied the specific position that the institution had assigned her in October 1964, when King Constantine II had issued the permission that authorized the marriage. The position was the position of the consort, a word whose function in the vocabulary of royal protocol is to describe the relationship of a person to a title rather than the possession of the title itself, and the word's function is the function of the subordinate clause, the dependent construction that exists in relation to the main clause rather than as the main clause itself. She was the consort of Prince Michael of Greece and Denmark. She was not Princess Michael of Greece and Denmark. She was not anything of Greece and Denmark. She was Marina Karella, who was married to the person who was those things, and the married to was the grammatical relationship that the institution had decided was the only relationship it was prepared to formalize. The daily texture of the position is what the available accounts of the family's social life in the decades of the Paris exile produce, when they are examined with the attention the texture requires, rather than with the attention the social calendar's surface invites. The daughters were addressed as Princess Alexandra and Princess Olga at the occasions that the royal social world generated, which were the occasions of the family gatherings and the dynastic events and the visits that the network of European royal families continued to produce as the natural product of the network's maintenance. Marina was addressed as Madame Karella. The addressing was not the addressing of hostility, because the people doing the addressing were the people who understood the institutional rule that produced the addressing and who were applying the rule in the same way that institutional rules are applied when they are the rules that the institution has decided are the rules, which is without the examination of whether the rule's application to the specific situation it is being applied to is the application that the situation warrants. The situation it was being applied to was the situation of a woman who had been married for decades to a man whose family she had been living inside for those same decades, who had raised 2 daughters inside the family's social world, who had managed the household's participation in the family's dynastic occasions and the family's social calendar and the family's relationship to the European royal network, and who was addressed in those occasions in the terms that the institution's 1964 decision had established as the terms of her membership, which were the terms of the non-member whose proximity to the member was the closest available description of her institutional position. The non-member had been making work that was in the Pompidou Center while the membership was being withheld, and the withholding had continued regardless of the work's presence in the Pompidou, because the institution's assessment of what warranted membership was not the assessment that had produced the Pompidou acquisition. The Greek monarchy was abolished in December 1974. The referendum that produced the abolition was held on the 8th of December, after the restoration of civilian government following the junta's collapse in the summer of that year, and the referendum produced a result of 69% in favor of the Republic, which was the result that ended the institution that had been managing Marina's non-membership since 1964. The ending of the institution did not end the non-membership, which is the specific quality of the decisions that institutions make about people that distinguish them from the decisions that people make about themselves, which is that the institutional decision outlasts the institution that made it. Marina was Marina Karella before the Greek monarchy existed, as the institution that had refused to name her, and she was Marina Karella after the Greek monarchy had ceased to exist, as the institution that had refused to name her, and the consistency of the name across the institution's existence and non-existence was the consistency of something that the institution had decided, rather than of something that the person had chosen. She had not chosen to be Marina Karella. She had been Marina Karella before the marriage, which is the ordinary condition of a person who has a name, and the ordinary condition had been converted by the institution's decision into the specific condition of the person who was being named, in the terms that the institution had decided were the appropriate terms for someone in her position, which were the same terms as before the marriage, because the institution had decided that the marriage had not changed the terms. The person whose position had changed by the marriage was Michael, because Michael's position in the succession had changed by the renunciation that the marriage had required, and the renunciation was the change that the institution had organized the marriage's permission around producing, because the institution's primary concern about the marriage had been the concern about the succession, rather than the concern about Marina, and the succession concern had been resolved by the renunciation, and the Marina concern had been resolved by the subordinate clause. What the abolition of the monarchy produced for Marina was not the liberation that the abolition of the institution that had not named her might have been expected to produce, because the liberation would have required the abolition to have addressed the naming directly, and the abolition addressed the institution rather than any of its specific decisions. The Greek royal family continued, after the abolition, as the Greek royal family, which is the specific survival that royal families achieve when the institution that has organized their public significance has been removed, and what remains is the social network and the dynastic history and the specific variety of prominence that the network and the history sustain independently of the institution's formal operation. The family continued to meet at the occasions that the network generated. The daughters continued to be addressed as Princess Alexandra and Princess Olga at those occasions. Marina continued to be Madame Karella. King Constantine II died on the 10th of January 2023, at the age of 82, in Athens, at a private clinic. He had lived in exile for most of the preceding decades, first in London, and then, after a legal settlement about the properties that the Greek state had seized from the royal family, in a house north of Athens. And the living in exile had been the living of a man who had been managing his relationship to the country he had ruled, and the institution he had headed, with the specific combination of residual authority and practical powerlessness that the exiled sovereign occupies. He had been the head of the family for 60 years, the person whose signature had authorized the marriages, and whose assessment of the membership's terms had organized the decisions that the membership's terms required. And his death in January 2023 produced the question that the preceding 60 years of the decisions had been accumulating without anyone being required to address it directly, which was the question of what happened to the decisions when the person who had made them was dead. The answer was the answer that the decision's institutional nature always produces when the institution that produced them has already ended, which was that nothing happened to them. The decision of October 1964 that Marina Karella would not receive the title of Princess of Greece and Denmark had been made by a king whose country's monarchy had been abolished in 1974 and whose person had died in 2023, and the decision's continued operation in the social world that the family's network maintained was the operation of a decision that had outlasted the institution, the person, and the political arrangements that had produced both. Marina was Marina Karella in January 2023, the morning after Constantine died, in the same way she had been Marina Karella the morning before he died, in the same way she had been Marina Karella since 1940. Constantine died in January 2023. Michael died in July 2024, 18 months later, and the 18 months between the two deaths was the period in which Marina's position in the family network was the position of the wife of the most senior surviving male member of the family, because the family's organizational hierarchy placed Michael, as the last surviving grandson of King George I of Greece, in the specific position of seniority that the survival of all the others had produced. The survival had made him the family's oldest male connection to the founding dynasty, and the connection had given him, in the last years of his life, the specific authority of the institutional memory rather than the operational authority, which was the authority of the person who remembered what the institution had been and who had been present at enough of its occasions to carry the memory in the specific form of the person rather than the archive. He was buried at Tartoy on the 1st of August 2024 in the royal cemetery alongside his parents Prince Christopher and Princess Françoise, in the ceremony that the Greek royal family and the connected dynasties of Europe had organized with the thoroughness that the death of the last surviving grandson of the first Greek king required. The eulogy described him as a prince, a historian, an author, and a man who had given up his succession rights to marry the woman he loved, and the description was accurate in the way that eulogies are accurate, which is the way of the description that selects the elements of the life that the occasion requires to be present, and that organizes those elements in the order that the occasion's emotional requirements produce. Marina sat in the front of the church in the white trouser suit and the emerald earrings. The daughters sat beside her. The daughters were addressed as Princess Alexandra and Princess Olga in the coverage of the funeral, which was the coverage that the Royal Correspondence Convention of describing the members of royal families in the terms that the family's institutional hierarchies produce had generated in the specific way that the convention generates it, which was automatically, without the examination of whether the terms being used were the terms that the person being described had chosen or had been assigned. Marina was described in the coverage as Marina Karella, Prince Michael's widow, which was the accurate description of her relationship to the person being buried and the accurate description of her institutional position after the burial, because the burial had converted her from the wife of the last surviving grandson of King George I of Greece to the widow of the last surviving grandson of King George I of Greece, and the widow was the accurate word for the position, and Marina Karella was the accurate name for the person, and the two together constituted the complete description that the institutional record was capable of providing. The institutional record was not capable of providing more, because the institutional record is the record of the institution's decisions, and the institution had made its decision in 1964, and the decision had been maintained through the abolition and through Constantine's death and through Michael's death and into the period of the burial's coverage. The decision was the decision of a 60-year-old subordinate clause, and the subordinate clause was still the subordinate clause, and Marina Karella was still Marina Karella, and the Pompidou still had the work, and the Menil still had the work, and the Thyssen still had the work, and the Benaki had done the retrospective, and Robert Mapplethorpe had made the portrait, and the portrait was still the frontispiece of the monograph, and the monograph was the monograph of an artist whose name had not changed across 85 years of the living that had been organized, in varying degrees and in varying ways, around the question of what the name meant and what the name did not mean, and what the difference between the two dimensions of the meaning cost the person who carried the name through all of it. The Patmos studio was still there. The burgundy floor with the 60 years of paint on it was still there. The watercolors on the desk and the notes in pencil were still there. The pine tree and the rhododendron and the nautical blue of the Aegean above the whitewashed rooftops were still there. The work was still being made. The name was still the name. And somewhere in the distance between the name and the title that the name was not, in the space that the 1964 subordinate clause had opened and maintained across 6 decades of the living and the making, and the exile and the daughters and the Pompidou and the Mapplethorpe and the funeral in the white trouser suit, was the story that neither the royal coverage nor the art world coverage had ever fully assembled in the single account that the story required, because the royal coverage was the coverage of the family, and the art world coverage was the coverage of the work, and the person, who was both the family's unnamed member and the work's named maker, was the person who existed in the gap between the two coverages, and who had been existing in that gap for 60 years, and who was existing in it still. The gap is what this account has been examining, and the examining is not finished, because the gap's dimensions are not fully established by the naming question alone. The naming question is the institutional dimension of the gap. The gap has other dimensions, and the other dimensions are the dimensions that the following parts of this account address, in the terms that the dimensions require, which are the terms of the art itself, and the terms of the family that the art was made inside, and the terms of the person who made both. The white paintings were made in the early 1970s, in the years immediately following the arrival in Paris, and what they say about the period in which they were made is what paintings always say about the periods in which they were made, which is not what the period's external events were, but what the person making the paintings was doing with the experience of being inside those events at the specific moment of the making. The external events of the early 1970s for Marina Karella were the events of the Paris exile, the apartment in the 16th, the daughters under 5, the husband beginning his writing, the Greek royal family dispersed across Europe, and her own position in it, organized around the subordinate clause that the 1964 decision had established, and that the 1967 coup and the 1974 abolition had maintained without examining. The white paintings do not depict any of these events. They are paintings about white, about the specific quality of white as a surface that has been marked and as a surface that has been left, and the tension between the marked and the left is the tension that constitutes the work, rather than the tension that the work depicts. The tension is not a metaphor for the artist's situation, because the reduction of a painting to a metaphor for the painter's biography is the reduction that takes the painting out of the painting and places it in the service of the biography, and the biography is not what the painting is for. But the tension is not unrelated to the artist's situation either, because the artist who makes a painting about the relationship between presence and absence is an artist who is thinking about presence and absence, and the thinking about presence and absence in the early 1970s in Paris, in the situation of a woman whose presence in the Greek royal family had been organized around the management of her absence from its formal recognition, was not the thinking of someone for whom the relationship between presence and absence was a purely formal question. The purely formal question and the biographical question coexist in the white paintings, the way they coexist in any serious painting that has been made by a person in a situation, which is not as equivalence, and not as illustration and explanation, but as the specific compound that the painting produces, when the painter is both a person with a situation and a painter with a formal problem, and the two are not separate from each other, because the person and the painter are the same person. Marina Karella had a formal problem that she had been developing since Tsarouchis and Kokoschka and Paris, which was the formal problem of the relationship between the mark and the surface. She also had a situation that she had been living since February 1965, which was the situation of the person who was present in a context that had organized itself around her non-recognition. The white paintings are the product of both, and the product of both is a different thing from either of them separately, and the different thing is what the paintings are. Alexander Iolas had understood this before Marina had been able to articulate it in the terms that she later used in the interviews, which was one of the things that made Iolas the dealer he was. The dealer who understands a body of work before the artist can articulate its terms is the dealer whose understanding is worth something to the artist, because the articulation is the aftermath of the making, and the making is where the understanding is first available, and the dealer who can access the understanding at the level of the making, rather than at the level of the articulation, is the dealer whose access is genuine, rather than acquired through the artist's subsequent explanation. When Iolas took me on, she had said, it was a celebration day, he would electrify everything. The electrification was the electrification of a dealer who had read the work correctly, and who communicated the reading in the form of the representation, which was the form that the art world's relationship to the work required to be available before the work could take the place in the art world that the work warranted. The 1975 show at the Gallery Iolas in Paris was the show that established the white painting's place in the art world's understanding of what was being made at that moment in European painting, and the establishing was accomplished in the specific way that gallery shows establish things in the art world, which was through the combination of the work's presence in the room, and the critical attention that the room's quality attracted, and the institutional attention that the critical attention produced. The critics wrote about the white paintings in the terms that serious critics bring to serious work, which are the terms of the formal analysis and the historical situating and the assessment of where the work stood in relation to the field's existing conversation. And the terms they reached for were terms that placed the work in the conversation about painting's relationship to its own materials, that the preceding decades of abstraction had been conducting, and that Marina's white paintings were contributing to, from a position that was specifically her own. The position was specifically her own in the sense that no one else was making exactly this work from exactly this formation in exactly this relationship to the European painting tradition, which is what it means for a position to be specifically one's own in the art world. The Greek formation and the Tsarouchis training and the Kokoschka influence and the Paris years and the specific quality of the visual intelligence that had organized itself around the relationship between the mark and the surface, since before Marina could explain why she was drawing on the walls of the Karella's house. All of this had produced the position, and the position was the position that the white paintings occupied, and that no subsequent critical account of them has been able to relocate to a different position, because the work is where it is, and where it is where the position is. The 1980s changed the work in the way that decades change work when the person making the work has been changed by the decade, which is not gradually and not according to a plan, but in the specific way that the person's engagement with their experience produces the formal changes that the formal problems the experience generates require. The color palette darkened. This is the description that the art historical summary of Marina's work produces, and the description is accurate but insufficient, because the darkening of a palette is the description of a symptom rather than the condition, and the condition was the condition of an artist whose relationship to the white had been the relationship of the early 1970s, and whose relationship to what the white contained had changed in the ways that the decade had changed what it contained. The human figures disappeared from the work across the decade of the 1980s, giving way to the atmospheric and the metaphysical, which are the terms that the art historical summary applies to the compositions that replace the figures and that communicate, in those terms, something accurate about the direction the work was moving, without communicating why the direction was the direction the work was moving. The why is the why that the biography provides, but that the biography cannot impose on the work, because the work's decisions about form are the work's decisions rather than the biography's illustrations, and the work had decided to move the figures out and to move the atmosphere in, and what the atmosphere contained was what the work had decided the atmosphere would contain, which was the specific quality of the absence that the figure's departure had made available. The absence that the figure's departure made available is the formal territory that the metaphysical label gestures toward without fully entering, and entering it requires the willingness to hold both the formal question and the biographical question simultaneously in the way that the paintings hold them, without reducing either to the other and without pretending that neither is present. The figure that disappears from the painting in the 1980s is the figure that is there and then not there, the presence that converts to absence without the canvas being disturbed beyond the conversion, and the painting that holds the trace of the figure's presence in the atmosphere that the figure's departure has left behind, is the painting of someone who understood from experience what it meant to be present in a context organized around your non-recognition and to leave a trace in that context that the context had not intended to accommodate. This is not what the paintings are about. It is what the paintings contain alongside what they are about, which is the formal problem of the relationship between presence and absence in paint. The containing of both is the specific achievement of the work, and it is an achievement that the separation of the art world coverage from the royal coverage has consistently made more difficult to see than it would be if the person who made the work were legible as a whole person in a single frame of reference rather than as two partial persons in two separate frames of reference that the institutional management of her situation had produced. Eliza was founded to protect abused children. The organization that Marina and Michael established in Greece, the charity whose full name is Eliza Society Against Child Abuse, was founded in the recognition that the specific vulnerability of children who cannot protect themselves from the people whose authority over them is the authority that should be providing the protection is the vulnerability that the society has the obligation to address through the mechanisms that the law and the social service and the institutional attention can provide when the attention is organized around the protection rather than the appearance of the protection. The family asked, at Michael's funeral, that donations be directed to Eliza rather than wreaths, and the asking was the asking of a family that understood that the work of the organization was more permanent than the flowers. The choice of child protection as the cause that Marina and Michael organized their philanthropic work around is the choice whose relationship to Marina's own experience of the institutional management of vulnerability is not a metaphor and not an explanation, but the coexistence of two things that are both true and that the separation of which would be the same reduction that the reduction of the paintings to the biography produces. Marina had been managed by an institution that organized itself around her non-recognition. The children that Eliza existed to protect were children being managed by people whose authority over them was organized around the use rather than the protection. The two things are not the same thing. The two things are also not unrelated, in the way that a person's choice of the cause they devote their philanthropic energy to is not unrelated to their experience of the conditions that the cause addresses. Olga, the younger daughter, studied at Princeton University and at Columbia University, where she completed a master's degree in architecture and then worked as creative director for Christian Louboutin, and has pursued the multiple practices of multimedia art and filmmaking and textile design and photography that the career description organizes into the label of the artist who works across forms. The working across forms is the specific inheritance of the formation that the Patmos house and the Paris apartment and the household where one parent was a painter and sculptor and the other was a writer and historian had provided, which was the formation of someone for whom the serious engagement with multiple modes of making was the default assumption rather than the exceptional choice. Alexandra, the older daughter, has engaged with art as a collector and patron, and has described the engagement in the terms of someone who grew up in the specific environment of a household, where the art was being made in the studio, and the books were being written in the study, and the seriousness of the making and the writing was the household's primary atmosphere. The primary atmosphere was the atmosphere that Marina had been creating in the studio since 1966, and that the children had grown up inside, which was the atmosphere of someone who went to the studio because the studio was where the necessary thing happened, and who communicated, through the going, that the necessary thing was the thing the household organized itself around, alongside the social calendar and the dynastic occasions, and the Paris exile, and the daughter's school, and the royal coverage that described the household in the terms of the prince, rather than the painter. The painter's inheritance passed to the daughters in the form of the daughters they became, which was the form that inheritance takes when it is genuine rather than instructional, which is the form of the person who has absorbed the formation without being required to repeat it. Olga makes work. Alexandra engages with the work that others make. Both are the inheritors of the household where the work was being made across the decades of the exile and the title denial, and the art world recognition, and the Pompidou acquisition, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the Eliza founding, and the Patmos studio, and the 60 years of the name that never changed. The name that never changed is still the name. The work that was made across 60 years is still in the institutions that acquired it, and the institutions that acquired it are the institutions that assessed the work on the work's terms rather than the institutional terms, and the terms that assessed the work correctly were the terms that the institution that refused to name her was never willing to apply. The refusal, and what it produced in the person who lived inside it, is the subject that the remaining parts of this account examine in the terms that the full account requires, which are the terms of the whole person rather than either of the partial persons that the two separate coverages have been producing across 60 years of managing the story in the two directions simultaneously. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The question that this account has been building toward across its 5 preceding parts is not the question that the title proposed, because the title proposed the question of whether Marina Karella ruined her life to marry a prince, and whether the palace erased her instead. And the account's assembly of the evidence has established that the title's 2 propositions require the examination that the propositions themselves resist. The ruining requires that the life be examined against the alternative life that the ruining prevented, and the examination produces not the clean answer that the ruining proposition requires, but the compound answer that a serious life's examination always produces, which is the answer of both and neither, the answer that the life contained the things the ruining prevented, and also the things the ruining made possible, and that the sum of both is the life, rather than the ruining, or its absence. The erasure requires that the erased person be genuinely absent from the record, and the examination of the record has produced not the absence but the specific variety of presence that the management of the coverage organized around the non-recognition produces, which is the presence of the person whose record the management has been managing and whose management has produced, across 60 years, the documentation of the management itself. The documentation of the management is what remains alongside the work, and the work is what remains alongside the documentation, and the two together constitute the record of Marina Karella at 85, which is the record of someone who has been making work since before she could explain why, and who has continued making work through everything that the 60 years between the 7th of February 1965 and the 28th of July 2024 contained, and who is making work still. The still is the word that the account requires to be examined before the account closes, because the still is the word that the management of the coverage has never been able to manage, which is the word of the person who continues regardless of the management, and the continuing regardless is the specific quality of the person for whom the making of the work is the necessary thing, and for whom the necessary thing is the thing that continues when everything else around it stops. The Greek monarchy stopped in 1974. King Constantine stopped in January 2023. Prince Michael stopped in July 2024. The management of Marina Karella's institutional non-recognition started in 1964 and has continued in the form of the name that is still the name that the Times placed in the subordinate clause on the morning of the 8th of February 1965, and the continuing of the management is the specific evidence that the management is the institution's response to something that the institution cannot stop. What it cannot stop is the work. The work is in the Pompidou Center and the Menil collection and the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection and the Voris Museum of Modern Art in Athens and the private collections that the 60 years of the international art world's engagement with the work have distributed it into. and the distribution is the distribution of the work that has been assessed by the institutions that assess work and found to be the work that those institutions are organized to hold. The institutions that hold the work are not the institutions that refuse to name her. They are the institutions whose assessment of the work was the assessment of what the work was, rather than the assessment of what the person who made the work was entitled to be called. And the separation between the two assessments is the separation that the management of her institutional non-recognition has never been able to produce in the art world that made the acquisitions, because the art world's acquisitions are organized around the work rather than the person and the person's institutional position. Robert Mapplethorpe is dead. He died in February 1989 of AIDS at the age of 42, and the death that came too early for the people who valued what he was making, and too late for the disease that had been taking him across the years before the death, was the death that left behind the specific body of work that the institutions of the photography world have spent the subsequent decades assessing in the terms that serious work requires to be assessed. The portrait of Marina is part of that body of work, and the portrait's placement in the monograph as the frontispiece was the placement that someone made because someone decided that the portrait was the image that said the most about who the subject was. And the saying, the most about who the subject was, is what the portrait does, and what it says is what it has always said, which is what a Mapplethorpe portrait says when Mapplethorpe has found the person rather than the performance. Alexander Iolas died in 1987, also of AIDS, at the age of 76, having spent the preceding decades transforming the international art world's relationship to the artists he represented in the ways that dealers of his specific quality transform the art world, which is by identifying the work that the art world had not yet organized its attention around, and making the art world pay attention. He had organized the attention around Marina Karella's work in 1975, and the organization had produced the reception that the Pompidou acquisition and the Menil acquisition and the Thyssen acquisition were the subsequent institutional expressions of. He is gone. The attention he organized is not gone, because attention that is organized around work that warrants the attention is the attention that the work maintains independently of the person who organized it. What Marina has said about her own situation, across the interviews she has given across the decades of the career and the marriage and the exile and the Patmos house and the title that was not given, is what she has said in the terms that she was available to say it, which were the terms of the interview rather than the terms of the formal account, and therefore the terms of the person who is answering the questions that the interviewer is asking, rather than the person who is constructing the account of the whole. The interview terms have produced, across the decades, a specific body of statement that this account has drawn on throughout, and that this final part examines as a document in its own right, because the document is the document of what the person who lived the life being examined has said about the living of it. She has said that when you let your life flow, everything seems natural to you. She has said that you follow your marked path, always bearing, whether consciously or subconsciously, your goals in mind. She has said that one thing that cannot be overlooked is love, and that when love is around, you can let yourself move forward with your eyes closed. She has said that art is all she knows to do since she was young, and that only then does she feel completely free, and that struggling with the material and the journey you make when you start a project gives you the feeling that everything is possible. She has said that, as Einstein apparently said, one thing he realized in his life was that the greatest force, more powerful than the division of the atom, is love. The statements are the statements of someone who has been asked to reflect on the life and who has reflected on it in the terms that the genuine reflection produces, which are not the terms of the complaint or the grievance or the political analysis of the institution's management of the non-recognition, because the complaint and the grievance and the political analysis are not the terms in which she has chosen to discuss the life. The choosing of the terms is itself the document, because the person who has the complaint available and who chooses not to lead with it in the public account of the life is making a decision about what the public account is for and what it is not for, and the decision tells something about the relationship between the private experience and the public statement that the available complaint would not have told. She has also said, in the Art Flyer interview that recorded the conversation at the Patmos studio with the burgundy floor, that the freedom she feels when she is working is the freedom she feels only then, only then. The only is the specific word that the freedom's description requires, because the only is the word that locates the freedom in the specific activity rather than in the general condition of the life. And the locating is the statement of someone who has understood from experience that the freedom is available in the making, and that the making is therefore the thing that the life organizes itself around. And the life that organizes itself around the making is the life that has identified the making as the thing that the other things serve, rather than the other things as the things that the making supplements. The life that identified the making as the primary thing was the life that produced the white paintings, and the subsequent work, and the Iolas representation, and the Pompidou, and the Menil, and the Thyssen, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the Benaki retrospective, and the Patmos studio, and the Eliza charity, and the daughters who became an artist and a filmmaker, and a patron and a collector, and the grandchildren who grew up in the households that the daughters built, and that the formation Marina had been conducting since the Athens walls, and the Tsarouchis lessons, and the Kokoschka summer, and the Paris years had produced in the people who grew up inside it. The life also produced the 59 years of the marriage that ended on the 28th of July 2024 in a hospital in Athens, and the ending was the ending that 59 years of a marriage's continuation produces when the continuation reaches the point at which it can no longer continue. And the point was the point at which Michael of Greece and Denmark, the last surviving grandson of King George I of Greece, the man who had given up his succession rights to marry a commoner, and who had spent the subsequent decades writing the 30 books about the dynasties he had known from the inside, and who had read the French edition of an Egyptian novel in his office behind the sitting area, where the fig tree cast its shade, and the fresh figs were served in the Patmos courtyard, died. He had been born in Rome in January 1939, the son of Prince Christopher, who had died when Michael was 1 year old, and he had lived 85 years in the specific manner of someone who had decided that the living was the primary project, and who had organized the living around the writing, and the family, and the Patmos house, and the wife who was the artist, and the daughters who were the princesses, and the charity that protected abused children, and the interviews that the royal journalists and the literary journalists had been conducting with him across the decades of the career and the life. He had said, in the Fox News interview published in September 2023, that he had not hesitated to renounce his succession rights, that he had found freedom in the renouncing, and that the freedom he had found was the freedom he had been looking for. He had found it in Marina Karella, which was the finding that the renouncing had made possible, and that the renouncing had cost the specific thing that the renouncing cost, which was the succession rights, and the succession rights of the third in line to a throne that would be abolished 9 years later, were the succession rights that the cost analysis of the renouncing required to be placed in the specific context of what was being renounced. What was being renounced was the institution's naming. He gave up the right to pass the name to his children and his wife, and the children received the name anyway, because the institution decided that the children were a different case, and the wife did not receive the name because the institution had decided that the wife was the case it had decided in October 1964, and the deciding had been maintained across 60 years of the life that the deciding had organized around its terms. The terms were the terms of the subordinate clause. The primary clause was something else. The primary clause was Marina Karella, born in Athens on the 17th of July 1940, trained at the Athens School of Fine Arts and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and the Kokoschka Academy in Salzburg, first exhibited at the Festival of Two Worlds in Spoleto in 1966, represented by Alexander Iolas from 1975, collected by the Pompidou Center and the Menil collection and the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection and the Vorez Museum, photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe, exhibited at the Earl McGrath Gallery in New York through the 1980s, founder of Eliza, widow of Prince Michael of Greece and Denmark since July 2024, still working at 85, in the studio above the whitewashed rooftops and the nautical blue of the Aegean, in the room with the burgundy floor splashed with the 60 years of the making, with the watercolors on the desk and the notes in pencil and the portrait by Mapplethorpe on the wall. The primary clause is what remains. The institution is gone. The king who refused her the title is gone. The prince who gave up his throne rights to marry her is gone. The dealer who electrified everything is gone. The photographer who made the portrait is gone. Marina Karella is in the studio. The work is being made. That is what remains. That is what the management did not erase. That is what the subordinate clause could not subordinate, because the subordinate clause is the institution's document, and the institution is the institution that ended in 1974, and what did not end in 1974, or in 1989, or in 1987, or in January 2023, or in July 2024, is the person who goes to the studio and makes the work, and who has been going to the studio and making the work since before the institution decided what to call her, and who will be going to the studio and making the work after the last person who remembers the institution's decision has stopped being the person who remembers it. The name is Marina Karella. The name is sufficient. The Greek royal family in Paris was not alone in Paris. This is the fact about the exile, that the coverage of the Greek royal family's specific displacement has most consistently failed to situate adequately, because the coverage organized itself around the Greek royal family as the subject of the coverage, and therefore around the Greek royal family's displacement as the displacement, rather than as one displacement among the many that the 20th century's reorganization of European political arrangements had produced, and that Paris had received with the specific hospitality of a city that had been receiving the displaced since before the 20th century had begun reorganizing anything. The Orléans, Michael's mother's family, had been in Paris since 1848, when Louis Philippe's abdication had converted the French royal family from the occupants of the Tuileries into the occupants of the exile that France's repeated cycles of monarchy and republic kept generating for the royal families that each cycle displaced. The Orléans had been in and out of France for the better part of a century by the time Michael arrived in Paris with Marina and the daughters in 1972, and their presence in the Paris that Michael arrived in was the presence of people who had converted the exile into the permanent condition and who had organized their social world around the specific community that the permanent condition generates, which is the community of the people who have been displaced from the same kind of place and who share, across the differences of their specific displacements, the common experience of managing a royal formation in a country that is not the country the formation was designed for. The Bourbons were in Paris. The Habsburgs were in Paris. The Romanov descendants who had survived the revolution were in Paris, or had passed through Paris and left behind the specific traces that the passage of a dynasty through a city leaves, which are the Russian Orthodox churches and the cemeteries and the social organizations and the specific quality of the Russian aristocratic exile that the Paris of the 1920s had produced and that the decades since had been sustaining in diminishing but still visible form. The House of Savoy was represented. The descendants of Napoleon were represented. The Spanish Bourbons before their restoration were represented. The European city that had not sent at least one member of a displaced dynasty to Paris in the century between 1848 and 1972 was the European city that had not experienced the specific variety of political reorganization that the century had been conducting, and there were not many of those. Marina arrived into this world in 1972 and occupied it in the specific position of the person who was simultaneously inside it and alongside it, which was the position that the institution's 1964 decision had produced, and that the position of the Paris exile had replicated in the new geography. She was inside the world in the sense that Michael was inside it, and she was Michael's wife, and Michael's wife was someone the world received at its gatherings and included in its social calendar. She was alongside it in the sense that the social world of the displaced European aristocracy is a world organized around titles and the specific recognition that titles produce, and Marina was the person in the room who was the wife of one of the titled, and who was herself not titled, and the not titleness was the specific social position that the room registered in the specific way that rooms organized around titles register the absence of a title, which is not necessarily with hostility, but with the automatic categorization that the titled room applies to the untitled person, which was the categorization of the person who was there in relation to someone else, rather than in her own right. The in her own right was the thing that the art world provided, and that the royal exile community could not provide, because the art world's assessment of who was there in their own right was organized around the work rather than the title, and Marina was there in her own right in the art world, in the specific sense that her work was in the rooms of the art world that the work's quality had placed it in. The Pompidou was not interested in who Marina was in relation to. The Iolas Gallery was not interested in who Marina was in relation to. The critics who wrote about the white paintings in 1975 were not writing about the relationship. They were writing about the work, and the work was the work of Marina Karella, which was the name under which the work existed, and the name under which the work was assessed, and the name under which the work was acquired, and the name under which the work was discussed, and the discussion of the work under that name was the discussion that the Royal Exile community's management of the titled and untitled never produced. The two worlds coexisted in the 16th arrondissement with the specific quality of two worlds that share a geography without sharing an organizing principle. And the coexistence was the coexistence that Marina navigated across the decades of the Paris years, with the specific quality of someone who had understood from very early that the navigation required the maintenance of both, without the reduction of either to the other. The Royal Exile community was the world of the husband and the daughters, and the social calendar, and the dynastic occasions, and the titled room's automatic categorization. The art world was the world of the studio, and the gallery, and the critical assessment, and the institutional acquisition, and the name that was sufficient for the name's purpose, which was the purpose of identifying the person who had made the work that the institution was assessing. The navigation of the two worlds simultaneously is the navigation that the available accounts of Marina's life describe without fully examining, because the available accounts organize themselves around one world or the other, and produce in the organizing the specific incompleteness of the account that has chosen its frame, and is therefore seeing only what the frame contains. The royal coverage frames the story around the dynasty, and produces the coverage of the wife of the prince in the exile community. The art world coverage frames the story around the work, and produces the coverage of the artist whose work is in the Pompidou. The person who existed in both frames simultaneously is the person that neither coverage fully produced, because the production of the person who exists in both frames requires the frame that contains both, and the frame that contains both is the frame that neither the royal coverage nor the art world coverage was organized to provide. This account is the attempt to provide the frame, and the provision requires the examination of both worlds as the simultaneous context of the same person, rather than as the alternative contexts of two different partial accounts of the same life. The specific social occasions of the Royal Exile community in Paris in the 1970s and 1980s were the occasions that the European dynasty's social calendar generates, even in the absence of the thrones that the calendar was originally designed to serve, which were the family gatherings, and the dynastic weddings, and the funerals, and the anniversaries, and the specific social forms that the people who share the memory of a common institutional past maintain as the evidence of the past's continued relevance to their shared present. The Greek royal family's calendar in Paris was the calendar of a family that had lost its throne in 1974, but that had not lost the network of relations that the throne's existence had generated, because the network of relations is the product of the marriages and the cousin connections, and the shared histories that the dynasty had accumulated across its existence, and that the dynasty's displacement had not dissolved. Marina attended. She attended with the specific quality of the person who is fulfilling an obligation of the position she occupies, rather than the person who is attending, because the attendance is the activity she has chosen from the available activities, and the fulfilling of the obligation and the choosing of the activity are not incompatible with each other, because the obligation's fulfillment is the thing that the position requires, and the position is the position that the marriage has placed her in, and the marriage is the marriage she has chosen. The two things coexist in the attendance, the way they coexist in the life, which is as the compound of the chosen and the required, that a life conducted inside an institution always produces in the person conducting it. What the attendance produced for Marina beyond the fulfillment of the obligation is the question whose answer is available in the account she has given of the social world of the exile community in the terms that the available accounts allow. She has described the social world in the terms of the cosmopolitan and the interesting, that the displacement of the European aristocracy across the major cities of the continent had generated, which were the terms of people who had been in multiple countries and who spoke multiple languages and who had the specific variety of the international perspective that the person who has been formed in one country and has lived in several others develops across the living. The cosmopolitan and the interesting are the qualities that the royal exile community in Paris possessed in the specific measure that the displacement and the formation and the historical self-consciousness that the dynasty produces in its members had generated, and the qualities were qualities that the social occasions of the exile community made available to the people who attended them. They were also, and this is the dimension of the exile community's social world, that the royal coverage of it has most consistently treated as the primary content rather than the secondary context, the occasions at which the management of the title and the non-title produced its daily social texture. The daily social texture of the titled room is not the texture of the dramatic incident, but the texture of the cumulative small occasions that the titled room generates in the course of its normal operation, which were the occasions of the introduction and the addressing and the seating and the social placement that the titled room conducts around the titles it contains, and the absences of titles that the untitled people in the titled room represent. Marina navigated these occasions with the same quality that she navigated everything else, which was the quality of the person for whom the navigation was the necessary thing, because the navigation was the condition of the life she had chosen, and the life she had chosen was the life she was living, and the living of it required the navigation rather than the resistance to the navigation. The resistance was in the studio. The studio was where the navigation ended and the making began, and the making was the thing that did not require the navigation, because the making was the thing that the navigation was the condition of, rather than the thing that the navigation was directing. The navigation was the condition, because the navigation was the management of the life that contained the studio, and the studio was the thing that the management of the life was making possible, and the making possible was the purpose that the management served. This is not the account of a person who managed the navigation reluctantly. It is the account of a person who managed the navigation with the understanding that the navigation was the thing that the studio required of the life outside it, and the studio was the thing that the navigation was for. The exile community in Paris was also, and this is the dimension that the displacement of the European aristocracy across the major cities of the continent most completely produced, a community of people whose relationship to time was the relationship of the displaced, rather than the relationship of the settled, which is the relationship that organizes itself around the sense of the provisional rather than the permanent, and that produces in the people living inside it the specific quality of the person who is managing the present in the awareness that the present's geography is not the geography that the formation was designed for, and that the geography the formation was designed for is no longer available in the form the formation anticipated. The provisional quality of the exile's relationship to place is the quality that the Patmos house eventually resolved for Michael and Marina, because the island was the place that was not the palace, and was not the exile, and was not the Paris apartment, and was not the Athens of the junta, but was the place they had chosen, for the specific reasons that people choose places when they have the freedom to choose, rather than the displacement to manage. The choosing of Patmos was the choosing of the person who had found the place that was not organized around the provisional, but around the specific quality of the permanent, that a small island in the eastern Aegean, whose character has been organized around the monastery of St. John the Theologian since 588, provides to the people who have found it, and who have understood that the finding is the finding of the thing they were looking for, without having been able to name it before they found it. Marina found it. The studio found her. The burgundy floor accumulated 60 years of the paint that the making produced, and the making continued in the studio that the finding had made available. The displacement community in Paris was the context of the decades before the finding. The finding was the context of the decades after. The studio was the context of both, because the studio was the thing that persisted across the contexts, rather than the thing that either context produced, and the persisting is the most complete available evidence of what Marina Karella's life was organized around, when the organization was allowed to be what it was organized around, rather than what the context required it to accommodate. The books appeared under the name Prince Michael of Greece. This is the fact about Michael's literary career that the literary coverage of the career has always treated as the straightforward attribution of authorship to the person who wrote the books, and that the examination of the career in the context of the marriage's institutional terms produces as something considerably more specific, which is the observation that the person who had given up his succession rights in order to marry a woman the institution refused to name had built his subsequent career on the name that the institution had provided, and that the institution's naming of him was the credential that the career required, and that the career's success depended on, in the specific way that the royal biography, written by the insider, requires the insider's credential to communicate the insider quality to the reader who is purchasing the insider account. Prince Michael of Greece is the name that appeared on 30 books across 60 years. The name is the name of the institutional membership that the institution had maintained even after the renunciation, because the renunciation had been the renunciation of the succession rights rather than the renunciation of the title, and the title had been maintained because the institution that had decided to maintain it had not required the renunciation of the title as a condition of the marriage's permission. Michael was still Prince Michael of Greece after the marriage, and Marina was still Marina Karella after the marriage, and the asymmetry of the institutional maintenance in the specific context of the two careers that the household was producing is the asymmetry that this part of the account examines. The asymmetry is not the asymmetry of two people with different careers in the ordinary sense of two people who have chosen different professions and who are pursuing those professions with the resources that their different formations and their different abilities have equipped them with. It is the asymmetry of two careers whose different relationships to the same institution have produced different relationships to the institution's naming power, and the naming power is the power that the institution exercises over the person it names and the person it does not name in the different directions that the exercise of the power produces. It names Michael Prince Michael of Greece, and the naming is the naming that 30 books carry on their covers, and that the publishers who produce the books understand as the commercial credential that the readers of royal biography respond to. It does not name Marina Princess Marina of Greece, and the not naming is the not naming that the art world's assessment of her work has never required the work to carry to communicate the work's quality to the institutions that have assessed it. The first books appeared in French, which was the language of the Paris exile and the language of the Orléans formation that had organized Michael's early years and that had given him the French fluency that a publishing career in French requires. The French publishing world received the books in the specific register that the French publishing world applies to works of royal history and biography produced by members of the dynasties being described, which was the register of the informed insider account that the French reading public's appetite for the European royal biography had been cultivating since the 19th century's production of the specific reading public that found the European dynasties' private histories the most reliably interesting subject available. The books sold in France. They were translated. The translations produced the international readership that the translations of French books about European royalty had been producing across the decades of the international market for that specific category of book, and the international readership was the readership that the book's commercial success depended on. The commercial success depended on the name on the cover. This is not a reduction of the book's quality to their author's credential, because the books were well reviewed as books, and the quality of the research and the writing was the quality that the well-reviewed books in any category require to produce the positive reviews that the commercial success benefits from. But the quality of the research and the writing was the quality of a book produced by someone who had access to the material that the insider access provided, and the insider access was the access that the title provided, rather than the quality that the research and the writing would have generated without the title, because the insider access is the access to the rooms and the people and the anecdotes and the private accounts that the title opens and that the talent deploys once the title has opened them. The title and the talent were both present in the 30 books, and the 30 books required both, and the both were available because the institution had maintained the title even after the renunciation had been required as the price of the marriage's permission. Louis XIV was one of the subjects. The biography of the Sun King that Michael published was received as the work of someone who understood the absolute monarchy from the inside of a family that had maintained the absolutist tradition across the centuries between Louis XIV and the present, and who had brought to the understanding of Louis the specific quality of the person who recognized in the subject the institutional formation that the writer's own formation had been organized around, which was the formation of the dynasty that understood itself as the expression of a principle rather than the product of a circumstance, and that communicated the principle through the specific form of the royal biography that Michael had identified as his literary medium. The photograph memoir that Michael published in 2023, the year before his death, was the book that the Fox News interview described as the document of 500 photographs gathered since he was 17, the personal archive of a life conducted at the intersection of the royal families of Europe and the cultural and social worlds that the Paris exile had placed him in. The book was received as the visual record of the insider's life, the photographs that only the insider would have taken because only the insider would have been in the rooms where the photographs were taken, and the insider quality was the quality of the name on the cover and the credential that the name communicated. Crown, Art, and Fantasy. A Life in Pictures was the title, and the title named the three things that the life at the intersection of the dynasty and the art world, and the imagination of the man who had been moving between them since he was born in Rome in January 1939, had contained. Marina's name did not appear on the cover. Marina's name appeared in the acknowledgements, as the wife, as the presence in the photographs taken at the Patmos house and the Paris apartment, and the social occasions of the exile community across the decades. The acknowledgement was the acknowledgement that the book required of the person who had shared the life that the photographs documented, and the person who had shared the life was Marina Karella, who appeared in the book in the terms that the book's subject was the life of Prince Michael of Greece, and that the life of Prince Michael of Greece had been shared with a person whose name was Marina Karella, and whose presence in the photographs documented the sharing. The art world's documentation of the sharing was different. The art world's documentation was the documentation of the art flyer interview, which had been published to discuss Marina's work, and which had described the Patmos studio, and the courtyard, and the coffee, and the figs, and the view of the Aegean, and had placed Michael in the background of the interview, rather than the foreground, which was the specific reversal of the foreground and the background that the couple's coverage in the royal press had always produced, with Michael in the foreground and Marina in the background of the profile of the prince. In the art flyer interview, Marina was the subject, and Michael was in his office behind the sitting area, visible from the courtyard, reading the French edition of the Egyptian novel, and the visibility was the visibility of the background figure who is present in the frame of the interview about someone else. The someone else, in the royal press, was Michael. The someone else, in the art world press, was Marina. The switching of the someone else is the document of the two worlds' different organizing principles applied to the same household, and the document tells the story of the household more completely than either coverage does separately, because the household contained both of the someone else's, and the complete account of the household required the presence of both in the foreground, simultaneously, rather than the alternating of each in the foreground that the two separate coverages produced. The 30 books and the 60 years of painting coexisted in the same household, in the same way that the two careers coexisted in the same apartment, and the same Patmos house, and the same social calendar, and the same exile community, and the same marriage, which was the way of two things that are genuinely different from each other, and that are conducted by two people who are genuinely different from each other, and who have organized their shared life around the respect for the difference that the 60 years of the shared life required. Michael wrote in his study. Marina painted in her studio. The writing and the painting were both happening in the same household, and were both the primary activities of the people conducting them, and the household that contained both was the household that the two careers required to be organized around the mutual recognition of the primacy of both, rather than the primacy of one over the other. The institution had organized the naming of one over the other. The institution's naming had produced the Prince Michael of Greece on the book covers and the Marina Karella on the art world's documentation, and the two namings were the two products of the same institutional decision about the same marriage, and the decision had produced the asymmetry that the 30 books covers and the art world's acquisition records together document when they are examined as the parallel records of the two careers that the same household contained across the same 60 years. The asymmetry is the asymmetry of an institution's naming power applied asymmetrically to two people who have been making their respective bodies of work with the same seriousness, for the same duration, in the same household, in the same geography of the exile community, and the Patmos island, and the Paris apartment, and the Athens visits, and the European social calendar. The seriousness is equal. The duration is equal. The household is the same. The geography is the same. The naming is different, and the difference is the institutions, and the institutions' difference is the difference that the 30-book covers document as the commercial product of the credential, and that the Pompidou acquisition documents as the art world's assessment of the work that the credential was not required to produce. The Pompidou does not have a Prince Michael of Greece on its wall. It has a Marina Karella. The cover of the book does not say Marina Karella of anywhere. It says Prince Michael of Greece. The institution named him something. The art world named her the same thing she had always been. The two namings are the two available documents of what the institution's management of the marriage produced in the two careers that the marriage contained, and the document, read as the document of the institution rather than the document of the careers, is the document of an institution whose naming power produced the credential that the books required, and whose denial of the same power produced the name that the art world's acquisitions carry. And the carrying is the carrying that continues regardless of the institution's existence or non-existence, because the acquisitions are permanent and the institution has ended. Prince Michael of Greece died on the 28th of July 2024. The books remain with his name on their covers. The institutions have his name in their catalogues as the author. The name is the name that the institution provided, and that the career required, and that the career's continuation required to be maintained. And the maintenance produced the 30 books, and the translations, and the international readership, and the specific place in the literature of royal biography that the insider credential had made available. Marina Karella is alive. The work is in the Pompidou, with her name on the acquisition record. The name on the acquisition record is the name that the institution did not provide, and that the art world's assessment of the work did not require the institution to provide, because the art world's assessment is organized around the work rather than the credential, and the work is sufficient for the work's purposes, and the name is sufficient for the name's purposes, and the purposes are the purposes of the person who has been making the work since before the institution decided what to call her. The institution decided in 1964. The work decided before that. The work's decision is the one that remains. Alexandra was born on the 15th of October, 1968, in Athens, in the middle of the junta years that this account's second part examined, and her birth was the birth of the first child of a marriage that had been contracted 3 years earlier under the terms that the institution had established, which were the terms of the managed permission, and the birth was also the birth of a person into the specific position that the managed permission's terms had produced for the children of the marriage, which was the position of the princess. She was a princess. Her mother was Marina Karella. The two facts coexisted in the same household from the day of Alexandra's birth, and the coexistence was the coexistence that the institutional decision of October 1964 had produced in the form that the institution's decisions about the naming of people in relation to dynasties always produce, which was the form of the simultaneous presence of the named and the unnamed in the same family, in the same rooms, at the same breakfast table, in the same experience of being the children of the household and the mother of the household, who existed in the different institutional relationships to the household's dynastic context. What Alexandra absorbed from that coexistence is the question whose answer is available in the account of her adult life, rather than in any direct statement she has made about the absorption. Because the absorption is the kind of formation that the person who has received it tends to describe in the terms of what she does, rather than the terms of what she received. And what Alexandra does is engage with art in the forms of the collector and the patron and the person who has organized her adult life around the support and the promotion and the preservation of the work that other people make. She is described in the available accounts of her professional activities as an art collector and a patron and a child life specialist, which is the combination of activities that a person who has been formed in the specific household of a painter and a writer and a princess and a non-princess develops when the formation's primary legacy is the understanding that the serious engagement with the creative work is the engagement that the serious life organizes itself around. The child life specialist dimension of Alexandra's professional identity is the dimension that the available coverage of the Greek royal family's second generation has treated most cursorily. Because the child life specialist is not the professional identity that the Royal Correspondence Convention of covering the royal family's members finds most legible in the frame of the coverage. The coverage frame is organized around the dynastic connection and the social occasion and the jewels at the funeral, and the child life specialist is the professional who works with hospitalized children to support their emotional and psychological well-being through the specific medium of play and creative activity, and the work is the work that happens in hospital rooms rather than in the rooms that the royal coverage's cameras enter. The hospital rooms are the rooms that the formation produced the interest in. The formation was the formation of a household in which the serious engagement with the creative work was the household's primary atmosphere, and in which the protection of the vulnerable was the philanthropic commitment that Eliza represented, and the combination of the creative and the protective in the formation produced in Alexandra the specific professional identity of the person who works with vulnerable children through the medium of creative engagement. The connection between the household's formation and the daughter's professional identity is not a metaphor. It is the specific way that formation works when the formation is genuine, which is the way of the person who does not repeat the formation's specific activities, but who extends the formation's principles into the activities that the extension requires. Nicholas Mirzians, whom Alexandra married in 1998, is a businessman, and the marriage was the marriage that the coverage of the Greek royal family's social occasions noted as the appropriate occasion to note, which was the wedding of a princess of Greece, and the coverage organized itself around the princess dimension rather than the art collector and child life specialist dimension, because the princess dimension was the dimension that the coverage's organizing principle required. The couple has two sons, Tigran, born in 2000, and Darius, born in 2002, whose names carry the Armenian heritage of their father's family, and whose growing up in the household of a child life specialist and an art collector is the growing up of the next generation of the formation that the Patmos house and the Paris apartment and the Athens studio had produced across 3 generations. Olga was born on the 17th of November 1971 in Athens, 3 years after Alexandra and 1 year before the family's departure for Paris, and her birth was the birth of the last child who would be born in Greece before the exile, and the timing of the birth in relation to the departure made Olga the child whose Greek formation was the formation of the infant rather than the child, which meant that the formation she received was the formation of the Paris years and the Patmos house, rather than the formation of the Athens she had left before she was old enough to have received it as the formation she would carry. The formation she received instead was the formation that the Paris apartment and the art world of the 1970s and 1980s, and the exile community's social calendar and the studio with the burgundy floor, produced in a child who grew up with a mother who went to the studio, because the studio was where the necessary thing happened, and a father who went to the study, because the study was where the necessary thing happened, and the necessary things happening in both rooms simultaneously was the atmosphere that the household conducted itself in across the years of the formation. Olga grew up in the atmosphere of the making, and the atmosphere of the making produced in her the specific engagement with multiple forms of making that her adult career has organized itself around. Princeton University and Columbia University are the institutions that Olga's educational formation passed through after the Paris years, and the passing through was the passing through of someone who had been formed in the household of a painter and a writer, and who was extending the formation into the institutional contexts that the American university system provides, when the person entering it is someone for whom the serious engagement with ideas and forms is the expectation rather than the discovery. The Princeton formation and the Columbia master's degree in architecture were the formations of someone who had decided that the understanding of how things are built, in the literal and the formal sense of the built, was the understanding that the subsequent making required as its foundation, because the architecture degree is the degree of the person who understands that the structure is the thing the surface requires, rather than the thing the surface supplements. The surface and the structure were both present in what Olga subsequently produced, which was the body of work across the multiple practices that her career description organizes into the label of the artist who works across forms. The multimedia art and the filmmaking and the textile design and the photography are the forms, and the working across them is the working of someone for whom the form is the choice that the material and the intention require, rather than the category that the professional identity is organized around. Christian Louboutin had engaged Olga as creative director for the specific reason that the creative director's function is the function of the person who understands how the aesthetic intention and the commercial product and the brand identity and the cultural moment are in conversation with each other, and who can organize that conversation in the direction the brand requires. The creative director's function is not the function that the royal correspondent's coverage of the Greek royal family's second generation identified as the primary content of the Olga story, because the creative director is the professional identity that the coverage frame organized around the dynastic connection finds less legible than the dynastic connection that the 2008 marriage to Prince Aimone of Savoy, Duke of Aosta, provided. Prince Aimone was born in 1967, the son of Prince Amadeo, Duke of Aosta, and his family was the Italian royal family, the House of Savoy, the dynasty that had produced the kings of Italy until the Italian monarchy's abolition in the referendum of June 1946. The marriage of Olga to Aimone was the marriage of a princess of Greece to a prince of the Italian royal family, and the coverage organized itself around the dynastic connection rather than the creative director. The children of the marriage are Umberto, born in 2009, Amadeo, born in 2011, and Isabella, born in 2012, and their names carry the Italian royal family's dynastic naming conventions that the House of Savoy had maintained across the centuries of its existence, and the naming is the naming that the institution provides, when the institution is the institution whose naming is the naming of the children. Olga's children are named in the Savoy tradition. They are also the children of the former creative director of Christian Louboutin and the multimedia artist and filmmaker and textile designer and photographer whose mother's work is in the Pompidou Center and whose grandmother's work laid the foundation of everything the formation had produced. The naming and the formation coexist in the same children, the way the naming and the formation had coexisted in their mother and their aunt and their grandmother, and the coexistence is the coexistence that the institutional management of the dynasty produces in the people who are simultaneously inside the institution and the people who make things. What Marina passed to her daughters was not the title that the institution had refused to pass through her, because the title was not hers to pass, and the institution had made the arrangements that prevented its passage through her, and that ensured its passage through Michael directly to the daughters, without the mediation of their mother's institutional position. What she passed was the formation, which was the thing that was hers to pass, because it was the thing she had made, rather than the thing the institution had provided. And the making of the formation was the making of someone who had been drawing on the walls of the Karella's house since before she could explain why, and who had converted the explaining into the work, and the work into the studio, and the studio into the household's atmosphere, and the household's atmosphere into the daughters, and the daughters into the people they became. The people they became are the people who engage with art. One collects and patronizes and works with hospitalized children through creative engagement. One makes across multiple forms and understands the relationship between the aesthetic and the commercial and the cultural moment in the terms that the creative director's function requires. Both are the inheritors of the formation that the Paris apartment and the Patmos house and the studio with the burgundy floor had produced in the children who grew up inside them. The formation that produced them was the formation of a woman who was not named by the institution and who named herself through the making. And the naming through the making is the naming that the daughters received rather than the naming that the institution provides. And the naming through the making is the naming that continues in the daughters and will continue in the grandchildren, and that the institution's management of the title's passage or non-passage has never been able to address, because the naming through the making is not the naming that the institution controls. The institution controls the title, the making controls the formation. The title passes through the institutional hierarchy, the formation passes through the household's atmosphere. The title named Michael's daughters, the formation made Marina's daughters. The daughters are both, and the both is the inheritance that the 60 years of the marriage produced in the people who received it, and the people who received it are the people who are still receiving it, in the forms that the reception takes when the reception is not the passive taking of what is given, but the active making of what the giving has made possible. The making of what the giving has made possible is the Karella inheritance, and the inheritance is not in the Tatoi Royal Cemetery where Michael is buried beside his parents. It is in the studio above the Aegean, and in the hospital rooms where Alexandra works, and in the creative director's office, and the filmmaker's studio, and the textile workshop, and the photograph, and the inherited formation, moving forward into the generation that the formation has produced, and that the formation is still producing. The still producing is the most complete available statement of what Marina Karella passed to the people who received the passing, and the still producing is the thing that the institution that refused to name her was never capable of producing or preventing, because the still producing is the thing that happens in the studio when the studio door closes and the work begins, and what happens when the studio door closes and the work begins is the thing that the institution has never been organized to enter. The Benaki Museum stands on the corner of Kumbari Street and Vasilissis Sophias Avenue in Kolonaki, the neighborhood of Athens that the city's serious cultural and intellectual life has organized itself around since the 19th century, and the standing is the standing of an institution that has been there since 1930, when Antonis Benakis donated his family's collection of Greek art and decorative objects to the Greek state, and donated the family mansion that housed the collection as the building that would house the museum, and the donating was the act of a man who had decided that the collection's meaning was the meaning of the culture it represented, rather than the meaning of the family that had assembled it, and that the culture's representation required the public institution rather than the private possession. The institution that resulted from the donation has spent the subsequent century becoming one of the most significant museums of Greek culture in the world, and the becoming has been the becoming of an institution that has expanded from the original Benakis mansion into additional buildings across Athens, and has organized its collection and its exhibition program around the understanding of Greek culture as a continuous tradition from antiquity through the Byzantine period, through the post-Byzantine period, through the modern and the contemporary, and the understanding is the understanding that produces the specific quality of the retrospective exhibition as the form of cultural recognition that the Benaki applies to the artists whose contribution to that tradition, it has concluded, warrants the retrospective's specific acknowledgement. The acknowledgement came to Marina Karella in 2005. She was 65 years old in 2005, and the 65 years had contained everything that the preceding 9 parts of this account have assembled, which were the walls of the Karella's house, and the Athens School of Fine Arts, and the École des Beaux-Arts, and the Kokoschka summer, and the marriage, and the title that was not given, the junta years and the daughters' births, and the Paris exile, and the gallery Iolas, and the white paintings, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the Pompidou acquisition, and the Menil acquisition, and the Thyssen acquisition, and the Earl McGrath Gallery, shows in New York, and the Eliza founding, and the Patmos House, and the 40 years of the work that the 65 years had been producing. The Benaki had looked at the 40 years of the work and concluded that the work warranted the retrospective, and the concluding was the concluding that the institution applies to the artist when the institution has determined that the artist's contribution to the tradition the institution is organized around has been sufficient to require the retrospective's specific form of documentation. The retrospective is a specific form. It is not the group show in which the artist's work appears alongside the work of others in the context that the group provides and that the individual work requires the group's context to make available. It is the show that is organized entirely around the one artist's work and that asks the viewer to receive the body of work as a body rather than as the individual pieces that the individual shows have been presenting across the career. And the receiving of the body of work as a body is the receiving that produces the understanding of the career that the individual shows have been producing incrementally, and that the retrospective produces in the specific form of the comprehensive view. The comprehensive view is what the retrospective offers, and what the Benaki retrospective of Marina Karella's work offered to the Athens audience of 2005 was the comprehensive view of the 40 years of making that the Athens audience had been receiving incrementally across the decades, and that the retrospective organized into the single exhibition, whose scope and whose chronological arrangement produced the understanding of what the career had been and what it had become, and what the relationship between the becoming and the being was. Athens was the city of the formation. The Athens School of Fine Arts on Petition Street, where Tsarouchis had shown Marina how to look at form and light, was the institution whose formation the retrospective was, in one of the dimensions that retrospectives always carry, the accounting of. The accounting was not the accounting that the institution keeps of its own graduates in the form of the alumni record that tracks the subsequent careers of the people it has trained, because the Athens School's record of Marina Karella is not the record that this account is examining. It is the accounting that the artist's own body of work produces when the body of work is assembled in the institution that the culture has established as the place where the accounting of that kind is conducted, and the institution the Greek culture had established for that purpose was the Benaki, and the Benaki had conducted the accounting. The accounting was conducted in Athens, which was the city that the junta had organized itself around controlling, and in which Michael and Marina had lived, as the only members of the Greek royal family permitted to remain, and from which they had departed in 1972 for the Paris that the preceding parts have examined. The departure had been the departure from the city of the formation, and the departure had produced the exile that the subsequent decades had been organized around managing, and the retrospective had produced the return to the city of the formation in the specific form of the institutional recognition that the return the exile community in Paris had always organized itself around hoping for, without the hope necessarily producing the form of the hoping's fulfillment that the hoping required. The form of the fulfillment that the Benaki retrospective produced was not the form of the political restoration that the Greek royal family's relationship to the abolished monarchy organized itself around, because Marina's return to Athens in the form of the retrospective was not a political return and was not organized around the political question of the monarchy's restoration that the family's displacement had always carried as the unanswered question behind the provisional condition of the exile. It was the return of an artist to the city of her formation in the form of the institution's acknowledgement that the formation had produced the work that the institution was now documenting in the comprehensive form of the retrospective, and the acknowledgement was the acknowledgement of the work, rather than the acknowledgement of the dynastic question that the family's displacement and the family's political situation had organized the coverage of that displacement around. The distinction between the return of the artist and the return of the displaced royal is the distinction that the Benaki retrospective's specific form had produced, because the retrospective is the form that addresses the artist and the artist's work, rather than the form that addresses the political situation that the coverage of the person had been organized around, and the addressing of the artist through the retrospective in the institution that the Greek culture had established for the addressing of artists was the addressing that produced, in the context of Marina's 65 years, the specific form of the recognition that the institution the artist had been made in had not been able to provide, and that the institution of Greek culture had now provided through the Benaki. The institution the artist had been made in had been the marriages institution, the Greek royal family, and its management of the naming question, and the Benaki was not the Greek royal family. The Benaki was the Greek state's cultural institution, the institution that the Greek culture had established to document and preserve and celebrate the contribution of Greek artists to the Greek cultural tradition, and the celebrating of Marina Karella's contribution through the retrospective was the celebrating that the Greek state's institution had concluded the contribution warranted, and the conclusion was the conclusion that the institution which had refused to name her had never been organized to reach, because the institution that had refused to name her had been organized around the naming rather than the work and the work's contribution to the cultural tradition. What the retrospective contained, in the specific terms of the works assembled for the Athens audience's comprehensive view of the career, was the 40 years of the making organized into the chronological form that reveals the career's development as the development of a sensibility engaging with the formal problems that the sensibility had identified as its problems and developing the relationship to those problems across the decades of the engagement. The early work was the work of the formation, the work that the Tsarouchis influence, and the Kokoschka influence, and the École des Beaux-Arts training had produced in the person whose sensibility had been organized around the visual world since the Karella's house walls. The white paintings were the work of the early Paris years, and the formal problem of the relationship between the mark and the surface. The darker palette and the atmospheric compositions of the 1980s were the work of the decade whose changes in the relationship to the figure and the ground had produced the changes in the work that the retrospective's chronological presentation made visible as the development, rather than the departure, that the individual shows had produced the understanding of as the isolated exhibition. The retrospective's comprehensive presentation of the development was the form of the understanding that the Benaki had organized for the Athens audience, and the Athens audience received it in the terms that the Athens audience brings to the work of the artist whose formation has been the formation of the Athens tradition, and whose subsequent career has been the career conducted at the intersection of the Athens tradition and the European and American art worlds that the Paris exile and the New York shows had placed her in. The Athens audience had been following the career in the incremental form of the individual shows, and the critical coverage, and the international acquisitions, and the retrospective organized the incremental following into the comprehensive view that produced the understanding of what the following had been following. The understanding that the following had been following was the understanding of a body of work whose consistency across the formal changes of the decades was the consistency of a sensibility that had identified its primary questions in the early formation and had spent the subsequent 40 years developing the answers that the questions required, and the consistency was the specific quality of the retrospective that established the career as the career of someone whose 40 years of making had been organized around the development of a position rather than the production of a series of responses to the market's requirements or the cultural moment's demands. The position was specifically hers, which is what this account has been establishing since the first part's examination of the formation that produced it, and the Benaki retrospective's organization of the 40 years into the comprehensive view was the organization that made the specificity visible in the form that the Athens audience could receive it. She was 65 years old when the retrospective opened. She had been making work since before she could explain why. She had been making work through the marriage, and the title that was not given, and the junta, and the daughters, and the exile, and the Iolas show, and the Pompidou acquisition, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the New York shows, and the Eliza founding, and the Patmos house. She had been making work under the name Marina Karella, which was the name that the Times had placed in the subordinate clause in February 1965, and that had remained the name through all of it, and the Benaki retrospective was the Benaki retrospective of Marina Karella, and the name on the retrospective was the name that the retrospective required to be the name, which was the name of the person who had made the work that the retrospective was organized around. The name on the retrospective was not Princess Marina of Greece. The name on the retrospective was not the consort of anyone. The name on the retrospective was the name that had been sufficient for the name's purposes since the walls of the Karella's house, and the name's purposes were the purposes of the person who had organized her life around the making of the work that the name identified, and the identification was the identification that the Benaki's institutional authority had now formalized in the specific form of the retrospective that the institution applies to the artists whose contribution to the tradition it is organized to document when the institution has concluded that the contribution warrants the documenting. The documenting was the documenting that the institution that had refused to name her had never been able to conduct, because the institution that had refused to name her was organized around the naming rather than the work. And the institution organized around the naming had concluded in October 1964 that the naming required was the naming of the managed permission rather than the naming of the recognition, and the recognition was what the Benaki provided in 2005 in the form of the retrospective, whose subject was the work rather than the managed permission, and whose name was Marina Karella rather than the subordinate clause. The subordinate clause and the retrospective coexisted in the Athens of 2005, the way the two worlds had coexisted in the Paris apartment and the Patmos house, and the exile community, and the marriage across the 40 years that the retrospective was documenting. The coexistence was the coexistence that the life had always required to be managed, and that the managing had produced the work that the retrospective was now the institution's documentation of, and the documentation was the documentation that the managing had made possible, and that the possible had produced in the form of the 40 years of making that the Benaki had assembled into the comprehensive view that the Athens audience received in 2005 as the return of the artist to the city of the formation, in the form that the artist's contribution to the tradition warranted. The form was the retrospective. The retrospective was sufficient. Patmos is 17 square kilometers of volcanic rock and whitewashed walls in the southern Dodecanese, the island chain that stretches along the Turkish coast in the eastern Aegean, and that the Ottoman Empire administered until 1912, and the Italian state administered from 1912 to 1943, and the German military administered from 1943 to 1945, and the British administered from 1945 to 1947, and the Greek state has administered since 1947. And the administrative history is the history of a small island whose significance has always exceeded its size, because the significance is the significance of the place where the Book of Revelation was written, rather than the significance of any administrative arrangement that any of the administering powers has been able to produce or withdraw. The Book of Revelation was written on Patmos by John the theologian, who had been exiled to the island by the Roman Emperor Domitian in approximately 95 CE, and the exile had produced the writing in the way that significant exile has always produced the significant writing, which is by placing the writer in a condition of enforced simplicity and geographic constraint, that the complexity and the geography of the life before the exile had not permitted, and the enforced simplicity had produced in John the specific quality of the visionary that the exile's removal of the ordinary distractions had made available. The monastery that was built on the hill above the Kora village in 1088 by Christodoulos of Patmos, with the authorization of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, was built in the place where the exile had occurred, and in the form that the place's significance required, which was the form of the fortified monastery that the medieval Mediterranean's specific conditions of piracy and political uncertainty had developed as the appropriate architectural response to the requirement of maintaining a significant site in the conditions of the era. The fortress monastery on the hill, and the Chora village that grew up around its walls, and the port of Scala at the island's lower level, and the 17 square kilometers of volcanic rock and whitewashed walls, and the Aegean surrounding all of it on every side. This is the geography that Michael and Marina encountered when a friend invited them to the island, and that they understood, in the encountering, as the geography they had been looking for, without having been able to name it before they found it. The not naming before the finding is the specific quality of the discovery of the place that is right, which distinguishes it from the place that is chosen for the reasons that reasons produce, because the place that is right is the place that produces the understanding of the rightness in the encounter, rather than the place that the reasons that precede the encounter have identified as the place that the reasons require. They bought the house 30 years before the art flyer interview that described it in 2016, which places the purchase in the mid-1980s, when the Paris exile had been running for over a decade, and the white paintings had been shown, and the Iolas representation had been established, and the Earl McGrath Gallery shows in New York had begun, and the daughters were teenagers, and the household had reached the specific point in its Parisian existence where the existence had produced everything the existence was going to produce in Paris, and where the something further was the thing that the existence required to continue producing. The island was the something further. The house that they bought and rebuilt is on the hill of Kora, in the village that has organized itself around the monastery since 188, and that has maintained across the centuries the specific architectural character that the Cycladic island village produces, which is the character of the whitewashed walls and the narrow streets and the blue doors, and the specific quality of the spatial organization that the hilltop geography requires, which is the organization of the compressed and the vertical, rather than the expanded and the horizontal that the mainland's unconstrained geography permits. The compressing and the vertical produced in Kora the specific quality of the dense and the intimate that the hilltop village of the Aegean produces when it has been organized around the same organizing principle, which is the monastery's presence on the summit and the villagers gathering at the monastery's feet, for long enough that the organizing principle has become the village's character rather than the village's arrangement. The house's courtyard expands in different levels, which is the art flyer interview's description of the spatial organization that the hillside site requires and produces. And from the courtyard, the whitewashed neighboring rooftops are visible below, and the nautical blue of the Aegean is visible beyond and above the trees. The turreted outline of the monastery is visible on the summit. The view is the view that the site has produced from the house's specific location on the hillside, and the view is the view that a painter looks at when the painter is in the courtyard rather than in the studio. And the looking at the view from the courtyard is the looking that the painter does when the looking is not the making, but the resting from the making, and the preparation for the return to the making. And the view that the rest and the preparation organize themselves around is the view that feeds the looking without requiring the looking to produce anything, because the view is there, and the looking is there, and the not requiring is the condition of the rest. The studio is below the courtyard, reached by a wooden staircase, a rectangular room with high ceilings, illuminated by two large windows that overlook the flowering rhododendron and the narrow street whose sounds enter through the windows when the windows are open, and the sound is the sound of the life of the village, rather than the sound of the making, which is the sound that the studio contains when the making is happening. The burgundy brick floor is splashed with the paint that the making has been producing since the studio became the studio, and the splashing is the specific record of the making that the floor carries, and that the art flyer interview described from the angle of someone entering the studio from above and seeing the floor's surface as the abstract expressionist painting that 60 years of the making had produced on it, without the making intending to produce it. The desk in the studio has the watercolor strokes and the notes in pencil that the making requires before the making begins, which are the marks of the preparation that precedes the work and that the work requires to be there when the work begins, because the preparation is the thinking that the work does before the work can do what the work does, and the thinking leaves the marks on the desk that the watercolor strokes and the penciled notes are. The monograph is on the desk. The frontispiece of the monograph is the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the portrait on the monograph on the desk in the studio above the rhododendron and the narrow street is the portrait that Mapplethorpe made of the person in the studio, and the person in the studio is the person who goes to the studio because the studio is where the necessary thing happens, and the necessary thing is the making. The light of the Eastern Aegean is the light that the Eastern Aegean's geography produces, which is the light of the long summer days, and the specific quality of the Mediterranean luminosity that the angle of the sun and the reflectivity of the sea and the whiteness of the island's walls combine to produce in the specific form of the light that the painters who have lived on the Greek islands have always described as the light that changed their relationship to the surface they were painting on. The light of the Aegean is not the light of Paris, which is the light that the northern latitude and the cloud cover and the city's specific atmosphere produce, and that the French painting tradition has organized its relationship to the surface around for 3 centuries. The light of the Aegean is the light that bleaches and clarifies and removes the gradations that the northern light preserves, and the painting that the Aegean light produces is the painting of someone who is in conversation with a light that does not permit the ambiguity that the northern light allows, and that requires the mark to be the mark it is, rather than the approximation of the mark that the northern light's generosity with the gradation permits. Marina had been trained in the northern light, in Paris and in Athens, and the Athens light is not the Aegean light, because Athens is a city whose light is the city's light, rather than the island's light, and the city's light is the light that the buildings and the streets and the traffic and the atmosphere of the urban density produce, rather than the light that the open water and the whitewashed walls and the monastic summit produce on a small island in the eastern Aegean. The Patmos light was a different light, and the different light produced, in the work that Marina made in the Patmos studio across the 30 years of the house's existence, the specific changes that the different light requires when the painter who has been working in one light encounters another light and allows the encountering to change the work, rather than insisting that the work maintain the relationship to the surface that the preceding light had organized. The changes that the Patmos light produced in the work are the changes that the art historical account of Marina's career describes as the later work's movement toward the introspective and the meditative. the return to nature, and the return to portraiture that the Korea's late period has been organized around. And the introspective and the meditative are the qualities that the Aegean island produces in the person who has been living on it for 30 years, and who has been making work in the studio above the narrow street for 30 years, and whose relationship to the island's light has been the relationship of 30 years of the daily looking that the view from the courtyard provides, and the daily making that the studio provides. The monastery on the summit has been there since 1088, and the being there since 1088 is the being there that the person who has been living below the monastery for 30 years absorbs in the specific way that the presence of a significant ancient institution absorbs into the life of the person who is living in its proximity, which is not the absorption of the institution's specific religious content, but the absorption of the institution's relationship to time, which is the relationship of something that has been in the same place and doing the same thing since 1088, and that has organized the life of the island around its presence for the entirety of that duration. The relationship to time that the monastery's presence communicates is the relationship that the artistic practice most requires, which is the relationship of the person for whom the making of the work is the activity that the time is organized around, rather than the activity that the time permits when the other activities have been completed. The monastery has been making the time for the making since 1088. The studio has been making the work since the mid-1980s. The Aegean has been the Aegean since before either of them, and the view from the courtyard has been the view from the courtyard since the house was bought and rebuilt, and the view and the monastery and the studio have been the three constants of the island's existence for Marina across the 30 years of the Patmos house, and across the 3 years since July 2024, when the island became the island without Michael's office, behind the sitting area, where the fig tree casts its shade and the fresh figs are served in the August afternoon. The office without Michael is the absence that the Patmos house now contains, alongside the studio that the studio has always contained, and the absence is the absence that the death of the person who occupied the space always produces in the space the person occupied, which is the absence of the specific human presence that the space had organized itself around, and that the space now contains, as the absence rather than as the presence. The studio contains the presence of the work, the office contains the absence of the writer, the courtyard contains the view, the monastery contains the 9 centuries of the making of the time for the making. The Aegean contains everything. Marina is 85 years old. She is on the island, or she is in Paris, or she is in Athens, or she is at the occasions that the family's calendar generates, now that Michael is no longer the person whose calendar organized the family's occasions, and that the daughters' calendars and the grandchildren's lives are organizing instead. She is in the studio when she is in the studio, and when she is in the studio the necessary thing is happening, and the necessary thing has been happening since before the institution decided what to call her, and the institution has ended, and the necessary thing is still happening. The island holds the studio holds the work holds the name. The name is Marina Karella. The island is sufficient. The title of this account proposed 2 things, and the account's assembly of the evidence across its 11 preceding parts has established that both propositions require the examination that propositions whose framing serves a narrative require, when the narrative is the narrative that the available evidence has complicated rather than confirmed. The first proposition was that Marina Karella ruined her life to marry a prince. The second was that the palace erased her instead. Both propositions contain something true. Neither proposition contains the whole of what the evidence establishes. The examination of what each contains and what each lacks is where the honest assessment begins, because the honest assessment is the assessment that the evidence requires, rather than the assessment that the narrative's framing was designed to produce. The ruining proposition requires a counterfactual, which is the alternative life that the marriage prevented from occurring, and against which the life the marriage produced is measured to establish the ruining. The counterfactual is the life of Marina Karella, the serious Greek fine artist without the marriage, the life of the person who had completed the Athens and Paris and Salzburg formation in 1965, and who had the trajectory that the formation had produced, and who directed that trajectory into the international art world without the dynastic constraint and the institutional non-recognition and the exile community's titled rooms, and the title that was not given and all of the management of the situation that the marriage had required across 60 years. This life is the life that the ruining proposition requires to be the life that was ruined, which is to say, the life that did not happen, and the life that did not happen is the life that the proposition is measuring the life that did happen against. The measurement produces the specific difficulty that all counterfactual measurements produce, which is the difficulty of not knowing what the unmeasured life would have contained, and whether what it would have contained would have been the thing that the measured life's comparison requires it to have been. The unmeasured life might have been the life of the serious Greek fine artist whose trajectory the formation had produced, and whose trajectory continued without the dynastic constraint and produced the international career that the formation's quality had made available. It might also have been the life of the serious Greek fine artist who entered the international art world of the late 1960s and 1970s, without the specific social world and the specific network of connections that the marriage into the European dynasty had placed her in, and whose absence produced a different trajectory that the counterfactual cannot fully anticipate, because the counterfactual does not have access to the specific mechanisms by which careers develop when the specific conditions that the measured life provided are not present. The measured life produced the Iolas representation, and the Pompidou acquisition, and the Menil acquisition, and the Thyssen acquisition, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the Earl McGrath gallery shows, and the Benaki retrospective, and the 60 years of work, and the Eliza charity, and the daughters, and the Patmos studio. And the specific combination of these things is the combination that the measured life produced in the specific conditions of the marriage, and the exile, and the title that was not given, and the studio that was maintained through all of it. And the combination is not the combination that the counterfactual can be confident the unmeasured life would have produced, because the counterfactual does not have access to the specific mechanism of the Iolas encounter, and whether the encounter would have occurred in the same form in the unmeasured life, and whether the Pompidou curators would have assessed the work in the same way in the absence of the specific conditions of the Parisian exile that placed Marina in the specific context of the Paris art world of the 1970s. The ruining proposition cannot be established by the available evidence. The available evidence establishes that the marriage imposed specific costs on Marina Karella, which were the costs of the institutional non-recognition and the exile and the titled room's management of her non-title, and the specific quality of the person who has been present in a context organized around her non-recognition for 60 years, and the costs were real, and they were paid by the person who carried them across the 60 years. But the ruining requires the costs to have exceeded the life's production in a way that the available evidence does not establish, because the available evidence of what the measured life produced is the evidence of a serious artist's body of work in the world's significant collections, and a 60-year marriage, and 2 daughters, and the Patmos studio, and the work continuing at 85, and the evidence does not support the reading of the life as the life that was ruined in the specific sense that the ruining proposition requires. What the evidence supports instead is the reading of the life as the life that was complicated in specific and documented ways by the institutional management of the marriage's terms, and that produced, through, and alongside, and sometimes despite the complication's specific costs, the body of work and the household and the formation that the evidence of the following 11 parts has assembled. The complicated life is not the ruined life, and the distinction matters because the distinction is the distinction between the 2 readings of the same evidence, and the honest reading is the reading that the evidence supports, rather than the reading that the narrative's framing was designed to produce. The erasure proposition requires the erased person to be genuinely absent from the record, and the examination of the record has produced not the absence but the specific and documented presence of Marina Karella in the record that the art world maintains, which is the record of the Pompidou acquisition, and the Menil acquisition, and the Thyssen acquisition, and the Benaki retrospective, and the Iolas representation, and the Mapplethorpe portrait, and the 60 years of exhibitions across the European and American art worlds. The palace, which is the institution that the erasure proposition names as the eraser, is the Greek royal family and the institutional decision of October 1964, and what the palace produced was not the erasure but the institutional non-recognition, and the institutional non-recognition is a different thing from the erasure. in the specific sense that the erasure removes the person from the record, and the institutional non-recognition refuses to add the person to one specific category of the record, while the person continues to appear in the other records that the person's activities produce. Marina Karella appears in the Pompidou's acquisition record as Marina Karella. She appears in the Menil's acquisition record as Marina Karella. She appears in the Thyssen's acquisition record as Marina Karella. She appears in the Benaki retrospectives catalogue as Marina Karella. She appears in the Art Flyer interview as Marina Karella. She appears in the Mapplethorpe monograph as the subject of the frontispiece portrait. She appears in the art world's documentation of 60 years of serious work as the person who made the work. The palace's refusal to name her Princess Marina of Greece produced a specific absence in one category of the record, which was the category of the institutional membership of the Greek royal family, and the absence in that category is real, and it is documented, and it was produced by the palace's decision of October 1964. But the absence in that category is not the erasure of the person from the record. It is the absence of the person from one specific category of the record, while the person continues to appear in the other categories that the person's activities have produced. The erasure proposition, like the ruining proposition, contains something true and lacks the whole of what the evidence establishes. What it contains that is true is the observation that the palace's management of Marina's institutional non-recognition was the management of someone who had decided that the person was to be present in the institution's social world without being named by the institution, and the managing around of the presence without the naming is a specific form of the erasure in the sense of the refusal to acknowledge, and the refusal to acknowledge is the form of the erasure that is most available to institutions that cannot literally remove a person from the record, but that can organize the record they control around the absence of the acknowledgement that the person's presence in the record they do not control has established. What it lacks is the recognition that the person whose presence in the record the institution was organizing around the absence of the acknowledgement had been building the record that the institution did not control across the same 60 years that the institution was organizing the absence. And the building of the record that the institution did not control is the specific form of the not being erased that the evidence has assembled across the preceding 11 parts. The Pompidou is not the palace's record. The Menil is not the palace's record. The Thyssen is not the palace's record. The Benaki is not the palace's record, in the specific sense that the Benaki is the Greek state's cultural institution rather than the Greek royal family's institutional management of its own membership. The art world's record of Marina Karella's work is not the record that the palace was organizing around the absence of the acknowledgement, and the person whose presence in that record the palace was not able to organize around the absence is the person whose presence in that record the evidence has established. The honest assessment is therefore the assessment that replaces both propositions with the account that the evidence actually supports, which is the account of a woman whose life was complicated in specific and documented ways by the institutional management of the marriage's terms, and who built alongside and through, and sometimes despite those complications, a body of work and a household and a formation that the evidence of the 11 preceding parts has assembled, and whose building of the body of work was the building that the institution could not erase because the building was happening in the records that the institution did not control, and whose assessment of the building was organized around the work rather than the institutional membership that the institution had refused to extend. The institution refused to name her. The work named her. The work named her Marina Karella in the Pompidou's acquisition record, and the Menil's acquisition record, and the Thyssen's acquisition record, and the Benaki retrospectives catalogue, and the Iolas gallery's representation, and the Mapplethorpe portrait's frontispiece, and the 60 years of exhibitions, and the Art Flyer interview, and the studio above the rhododendron, and the narrow street on the hill of Cora, above the nautical blue of the Aegean. The naming is the naming that the work produces when the work is the work that the institutions which assess work have concluded is the work that requires the naming, and the naming that the work produces is not the naming that the institution that refused to name her was organized to produce. The institution that refused to name her has ended. The Greek monarchy was abolished in December 1974. King Constantine II, who had issued the managed permission in October 1964, and whose issuing had included the subordinate clause about the title that would not be given, died in January 2023. Prince Michael, who had accepted the subordinate clause as the price of the permission, and whose acceptance had produced the 59 years of the shared life, and the 2 daughters, and the Patmos house, died in July 2024. The institution is gone. The people who maintained the institution's decision are gone. The decision's management of the institutional record has ended, with the institution and the people who maintained it. What remains is the work. The work remains in the Pompidou and the Menil, and the Thyssen, and the Benaki, and the private collections that 60 years of the international art world's engagement with the work has distributed it into. The work remains with the name that the institution refused to provide, and that the work had always carried, which is the name Marina Karella, and the name carries the work, and the work carries the name, and the two together constitute the record that the honest assessment produces when the honest assessment has completed the examination of what the evidence establishes, rather than what the narrative's framing was designed to produce. She is 85 years old, and still working in the studio above the Aegean. The work being made in the studio is the work that will enter the record with the name Marina Karella, and the entering is the entering that the work has been performing across 60 years of the making, and that the making will continue to perform for as long as the making continues. The making continues. That is the honest assessment. It is also the sufficient one. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.